Mr. Speaker, thank you very much indeed. Mr. Speaker, can I start by saying that I was very pleased indeed to see and recognize a number of young people in the gallery during the course of the debate for the past 3 days. I think towards the end yesterday, honourable members opposite finally managed to turn them off. But I was very, very pleased, and it filled me with hope for the future of this community, that there were young people listening to the arguments, that there were young people engaged in the arguments, and that engagement in years from now will stand us in good stead as they have some collective memory of what was debated in this place the last year before an election in 2019. That can only be good, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it will not have been lost on those young people that there was only support for the increases in their maintenance grants from 11 out of the 17 votes in this House. I think that they will understand who has been increasing the spending on tuition fees and adding to the opportunities to go away to study a second degree, who's been voting in favor of that and who's been voting against. 11 to 6 in this House. Well, Mr. Speaker, other than that, it's been a long week and it's only Thursday. It's been a long week and it's only Thursday, and most members on this side of the House, I know, spent a lot of their time preparing for this debate with their officials, no doubt members opposite too. But this weekend, Mr. Speaker, I assume that honourable members opposite will start to enjoy their long weekend too. Bank holiday in the sun, Mr. Speaker. Albert Isola leaves tomorrow to Asia. He's going to be flying over the weekend to represent our people there. Then he goes to the Cayman Islands to represent me. I can't go because we may have a new Prime Minister and I need to be there. And so, Mr. Speaker, I guess that's why Desperate Dan called him Invisible Al. We don't see him, Mr. Speaker, because he's out travelling the world, ensuring that Gibraltar's products are properly sold. He's always working. But, Mr. Speaker, I do realise, of course, that Mr. Feetham felt he had to do something to try and hit Mr. Isola because of Mr. Isola's effective, damning attack on the illogic of Roy Clinton's arguments on the £1,000 nominal line. So, fear not, Albert, they were just trying to deflect. Mr. Likudi, off to Asia as well, to carry on working on Monday on the bank holiday. I think what we've done, Mr. Speaker, is we've started the tradition, and that side of the House does the demolition jobs on the logic of what Roy Clinton says. He was destroyed by Gilbert Likudi's arguments on his mistakes on the university capital and recurrent spending last year, and this year he was destroyed again by the arguments put and illustrated by Albert Isola on the nominal line. Joe Bossano's not going to sit still either, Mr. Speaker. He leaves tomorrow. So much for a long weekend holiday for us on this side of the House. He goes tomorrow to America, to a British trade mission to Cuba, Mr. Speaker. Samantha Sacramento leaves tomorrow, no weekend for her either, to a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association event. And, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Chief Minister and I leave on Sunday to discharge the honour of representing Gibraltar at the United Nations in New York. I didn't see my children last weekend. I won't see them this weekend. I'll get one day with them. But as far as they're concerned, we do no work, Mr. Speaker. And it's not even a sacrifice, because it is a privilege and an honour to be able to do this work for the people of Gibraltar. And it's not just us, Mr. Speaker, doing that work, working the weekends. It's not just this team. It's also our senior officials as well, and our junior officials as well. And what we do, Mr. Speaker, is we do the job for which we were elected. To come here and to be denigrated for it, but we do the job for which we were elected. You won't find us, Mr. Speaker, spending our days smoking and drinking coffee at timeout instead of going to the office, was the case with GSD ministers. There was a GSD minister, Mr. Speaker, who never turned up for interview at the ETB. Mr. Speaker, I'm making these points because I have to. I make these points because I have to point out that and all the other inconsistencies in the arguments that they have made during the course of the past 48, almost 72 hours. And when I make these points, Mr. Speaker, I'm making them about the official opposition, not about the Honourable Lady. I was very keen to point out the 11.6 when I was dealing with the points on tuition fees and maintenance grants. I will address the arguments she put separately towards the end of my contribution. Mr. Speaker, they have told, in the past 72 hours, a lot of porky pies about us. In response, I will limit myself to telling the truth about them. Because, Mr. Speaker, the truth is more powerful, much more powerful than lies. And I will take absolutely no pleasure whatsoever in pointing out all of the negative and destructive arguments that they've made which are untrue. I do wish, Mr. Speaker, that they had been constructive. If I was advising them, not that they'd ever take my advice, if I was advising them, I would have told them in particular in this year, in an election year, to be constructive. Hope always wins over hate, Mr. Speaker. And what our people want is hope, Mr. Speaker, not hate. They want constructive argument, not destructive argument. But, Mr. Speaker, even in this election year, they've decided to be destructive. So I will not be destructive, Mr. Speaker. I will just deconstruct the arguments that they put. That, I think, is what our people deserve. I think it's the best way to understand what this appropriation is about. Mr. Speaker, every morality play ends the same way. When we're reading a play, we get to understand all of the characters. Because we're the reader, we're reading behind the action, and we know who's telling the truth and who's lying. We know which character to side with and which character not to side with. We know which character is trying to dupe, and we know which character is doing their best, working their hardest, telling the truth. And because, Mr. Speaker, this debate is about the state of the nation, it has become a little bit more about who is telling the truth than anything else. Because it's not just about who's telling the truth about the numbers, it's about who's telling the truth about the nation and the way that the nation is progressing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, despite the early and nervous point of order that Mr. Clinton tried to make, in fact, the debate has spilled over into allegations and innuendos that have gone beyond the estimates. Not from this side of the House. You've had departmental reports from this side of the House. But from the other side, innuendos, allegations, despite the nervous point of order made by Mr. Clinton at the beginning of the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, I said in my early intervention that I would not allow the innuations and allegations of ruthless men to damage the reputations of good men. And so, Mr. Speaker, in the coming hours, like in every good morality play, I am going to demonstrate why the good men and women are sitting here and why the ruthless men are sitting there. I don't extend that description to the Honourable Lady, of course, although I disagree vehemently with some of what she said, and I'll demonstrate why. Mr. Speaker, too often, however, politics isn't a morality play. You can't read behind what is happening. Too often, that's not the case. But, Mr. Speaker, this State of the Nation debate at a GSD versus GSLP level has been going on now for almost 3 decades. And if you bother to read the debates, starting in 1988, going through all of the period of Caruana versus Bossano, Bossano versus Caruana, it makes for fascinating reading if you've got the time or the inclination. Indeed, instead of just reading it, once we brought the cameras into this place, people can watch it. People can watch from 2012 onwards. They haven't got to read And once we started the monthly meetings, Mr. Speaker, you could watch every month, although I recognize that Brexit has unfortunately stopped us from having that frequency which we so desire. But whether you watch the Hansard, Mr. Speaker, of the videos, or you read the Hansard over the past 30 years, this morality play is now ready for a final act. You see, Mr. Speaker, this culebrón really starts in 1991 and heats up in 1995. In 1995 is the first time that a GSD opposition called a GSLP budget an optical illusion. So much for original thinking, Mr. Speaker. An optical illusion is like a mirage. So we're not watching anything original here. Nobody has got up and said something new. The GSD have said in 2011 the same thing they said in 1995. That was the first year that they poo-pooed the golden rules that they now hail as gospel, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I almost felt like titling Joe Bossano's budget speech before it went to the media as a letter from St. Joseph to the apostles. 1995 was the first time that Obi-Wan Bossano was threatened by the emperor, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I got my terminology wrong. But I'll come to the issue of the young apprentice later. It doesn't need to worry. So 1995 was the first mirage reference, Mr. Speaker. The mirage in 1995 was Europort and the reclamation on the west side of Gibraltar. The culprits were then, allegedly, Bossano and Feetham. The names don't change in this place, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Mr. Michael Feetham, who was then Minister for Trade and Industry. And, Mr. Speaker, with all of their middle-class gusto and bad milk, we had to endure in 1995 allegations of debt which were going to destroy the economy and the public finances, of optical illusions, Mr. Speaker. Then, Mr. Speaker, in 1995, they were saying it was an optical illusion, that the debt was going to destroy the economy, and that the GSLP had borrowed £100 million. That was 1995. I know now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not the only one who reads the Hansard. They obviously read it too. They change the date and they repeat the arguments. Things don't change, Mr. Speaker. They just get bigger. Look at this issue of the line that we open in the estimates when we need to open a nominal line in the INDF. Now it's £1,000, Mr. Speaker. But as your very timely intervention reminded us, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for that, by the way, because it demonstrated that this idea that this was something new that only happened under the GSLP, that we had a line for £1,000 or something new, your timely intervention reminded us it has happened for time immemorial. It was established and normal. That which Mr. Clinton was pretending was scandalous was established and normal even in your time, Mr. Speaker. You demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, that in your day, it was £100, and today it's £1,000. Well, in 1995, they claimed 100 million of debt. Today, they claim 1 billion of debt with a mirage. So in 1995, optical illusion, 100 million debt. 2011, mirage, 1 billion of debt. The same old GSD playbook. Mr. Speaker, remember that I reminded the House last year when they were playing the other GSD argument. You're going to make Gibraltar bankrupt. I demonstrated that actually that argument had gone on for even longer. That one had started in the 1970s. You and Sir Joe were engaged with similar banter and other members of this House. And I sometimes worry, Mr. Speaker, when I go back and I look at these things and I remind the House that it's just the same argument being put again with the numbers slightly higher, that people aren't listening, that honourable members aren't listening, that I do all this research for nothing. I guess I need not have worried, Mr. Speaker. Because the honourable and always affable Mr. Llamas did me the honor, Mr. Speaker, in his speech of referring to my speech last year in his introduction. And he, I think, indicated he was quite gratified to see, as a citizen, that these things had been said before and actually Gibraltar was never bankrupt. And absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, we should all be gratified with that. But unfortunately, it is a reality that these allegations are bandied about. Mr. Yama said, no Gibraltarian would ever want to intentionally jeopardize the economic future of our nation. More so those who stand for election and have earned the trust and respect of the electorate, I suppose. I absolutely agree with those sentiments 100%. But, Mr. Speaker, by raising the spectre of impropriety, in 1995 it was the perception of impropriety. Or raising, Mr. Speaker, the spectre or perception of financial difficulty or impending bankruptcy, you can actually talk an economy down. In fact, Mr. Speaker, many recessions start in that way, talking an economy down. But that's not what we're seeing in this morality play, Mr. Speaker, between the GSD and the GSLP. In this culebron, Mr. Speaker, the GSD is trying to repeat the deception it achieved in 1995. In 1995, their allegations of 100 million of debt and that everything was an optical illusion led to them winning the election in 1996. So that's what they're trying to do, and people need to understand it. Everybody watching this debate needs to know that the only reason that they have been told that their magnificent record surpluses are a mirage is because they want to use the same trick they used against Joe Bolsonaro in 1995 to deceive the electorate into blowing them into power this year. In the same way that the £100 in the line became the £1,000 in the line today, the 100 million has become the 1 billion of the allegations. Freddie Vasquez has morphed into Roy Clinton. That's all that's happened, Mr. Speaker. That's all that's happened. The optical illusion is now a mirage. Same old, Mr. Speaker. No original thinking. And so, Mr. Speaker, this morning what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce a potted history of those 30 years of debate to show the reader, perhaps many years from now, or the listener or the watcher, perhaps now, that now they have enough of this morality play, of this culebron, to work out beyond peradventure who is telling the truth and who is telling a lie. Who they should trust and who they should not trust. For them to see who cowered away from the fight and who turned to the dark side to achieve the ambitions of power sooner. For them to see who stood up to fight. And the most important thing, Mr. Speaker, that I will demonstrate by the end of my reply, what I will show, what I will prove, Mr. Speaker, is that they are just once again telling the same lie. The big lie of the 1995 debt and optical illusion. They're just dusting it down and adjusting it for inflation, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, once I've done that, I think the reader, the watcher, the listener, will say, goodness, if I'd known that in 1995, I would have taken a completely different view. And I cannot trust the GSD now in 2019 because the Chief Minister has demonstrated to me from their statements and what they've said before, if I bother to look back, that I cannot trust them. I will not be deceived twice by the same party. And they can see, Mr. Speaker, they will see that it's not just lies about the mountain of debt or the mirage. They can also see the lies about the alleged web of companies, Mr. Speaker. Web of companies. Mr. Speaker, they almost make Joe Bolsonaro appear like Peter Parker, spinning webs like Spider-Man. These are the webs that they were going to dismantle the morning after May 1996. What did they do? They made them bigger, Mr. Speaker. That was another point made by Freddie and Keith and Peter, Mr. Speaker. The web of companies created by Joe Bolsano was a bad thing. It had to be dismantled because it obscured transparency in government finance. That's another strand of this culebron, Mr. Speaker. They won in 1996 with all those arguments. They convinced the public that the web of companies was a bad thing. And yet in 1996, what they did was grow the web of companies. The web of companies, Mr. Speaker, became the government's corporate structure. So, web, corporate structure. Rat-infested reclamation on the east side. Sovereign Bay. Mr. Speaker, you couldn't make it up. But look, chapeau to the 1995-1996 team. They won, they did it, they spun a yarn, and they won. But that always happens in a morality play. The good guy always loses the first time. And then, Mr. Speaker, what they didn't just add companies, they added trading companies. They added trading companies with losses, with £100 million of accumulated losses when we were elected. I had to do a ministerial statement, Mr. Speaker, setting out the fact that we'd found £100 million of company debt in the GSD web of companies, because I got a doomsday memo from the then financial secretary, and they said all of this was a lie. Because they were also using the companies to fund capital expenditure. They were doing the two things, funding capital expenditure through companies and funding recurrent expenditure through companies, which they put into the web of companies, which became the corporate structure. Mr. Speaker, they have said repeatedly that there was no such thing as a £100 million hole in the company. I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Mr. Clinton for the arguments that he deployed on Monday, because by following those arguments through, one will get to the demonstration later in this address that actually the £100 million loss in the companies was there. But the way that Mr. Clinton structured his speech, Mr. Speaker, it becomes very easily actually to show where they put the £100 million and why they were there. So I'm very, very grateful for the way that he structured his speech for that reason, as I'll come to. Everything that they said in 1995 was bad about the newly canonized Joe Bolsano, Mr. Speaker. They did more and more and more of. They said 100 million of debt was bad. It wasn't there, but they acquired more debt. They said the companies were bad. They acquired more companies. They said that they were being used for borrowing. They brought it in for borrowing and for spending recurrent expenditure. This is not a case, Mr. Speaker, of a party that suffers in vino veritas, Mr. Speaker. They don't get drunk and tell the truth, or maybe they get drunk with power and they tell the truth. This is a case of in imperium verite. In other words, when we are in power, you see the truth. The GSD now has moved on, Mr. Speaker. It's not Freddy Vasquez who was ruthless and effective. It's Roy Clinton who's ruthless but ineffective. It's not Peter Caruana, Mr. Speaker, because probably they've got no one to replace him with. I mean, the equivalent of Peter Caruana in 1995 is Elliot Phillips today here, the leader of the opposition. There's still Keith, Mr. Speaker, back from the dead. But it's a little bit like a hydra, the GSD. You cut off its head, and a number of other heads come up, Mr. Speaker. All of them not as good. Now trying to canonize the man that they assassinated in 1996, because there was an attempt at a character assassination between the GSD and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the United Kingdom of Joe Bolsano, which did not succeed because the man is made of metal and rock like no one else. Otherwise, they would not be able to try to canonize the man they assassinated or tried to assassinate 20 years ago. Now they say that all his economic rules have to be followed to the letter. Mr. Speaker, this is political schizophrenia of the worst sort. Indeed, it cannot be schizophrenia. It has to be hypocrisy. Because it's too clearly thought out, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, in some instances, they are saying things which are logically irreconcilable. Now, they're either running a strategy there which the person reading the morality play will say is nonsensical, or they're running a strategy which is to be all things to all men. We'll say the things we have to say, even though they're irreconcilable. Those who want to hear us say one thing will hear us, those who want to hear us say another thing will hear us. But, Mr. Speaker, by the end of this analysis, everyone will know where the truth lies, where it lay in 1995 and 1996, and where it lies today. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that in their quest to win an election, the honourable members opposite have no regard for the economy or the impact of what they say. It's just a desire to win. When I say this is not a budget where I need to win an election, and I say my responsibility is not to win an election, my responsibility is to be careful with Gibraltar and make sure that we get to the right destination. My desire, my wish might be to win an election, but my responsibility is to steer Gibraltar safely through these difficult times. Theirs is different, Mr. Speaker. Their desire overcomes their responsibility. And the way that they act is as if the economy did not matter. They will say whatever they have to say in order to be somehow swept into power. And I'm already hearing nervous Billy Bunter-style laughter, Mr. Speaker, from the opposite side. Because they know that they've called this the big lie budget, just like they did last year. They've called it the mirage, Mr. Speaker. This is designed to paint their picture of a nation that cannot afford a balanced view of where we are and where we're going. If at least they said, you can't do those things because you're spending too much money. And they said, don't build the schools. Don't build the schools. The GSD says don't build the schools. Well, look, you might have some respect for their position. The GSD says don't build the children's primary care center, don't build the primary care center. You might have some respect for their position. But they don't want to put their money where their mouth is, Mr. Speaker. They want to say don't spend the money, but I don't want to say don't do the schools. They want to say don't spend the money, but then they say give the pay rise to the teachers immediately, otherwise you're being unfair and the wheels are coming off your industrial relations strategy. Don't build the houses. Speaker, come on. They must be clever enough to realize that if they are not prepared to have the gumption to tell us to stop those projects, they cannot seriously be telling us that the money is not there and that this is just a mirage. Especially, Mr. Speaker, when their whole attack is actually not don't build it. Their whole attack is, therefore, not there isn't money. Their whole attack is don't put it through the companies. Put it through the INDF. Their whole attack. Well, look, Mr. Speaker, I thought that before they prayed to St. Joseph, they prayed to St. Peter. And putting capital spending through companies is something that, I've told them before, but I will demonstrate to them again, was done by them in government, by the greatest Gibraltarian of all time, according to Mr. Feetham, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, if at least they were honest and told us to stop the spending, then people could choose whether they want them or us. Do they want them in power, stopping the projects, stopping the new primary care centres, stopping the houses, stopping the schools, and stopping the sports facilities, although they're likely to have been built? Or do they want us in power, building schools and building homes? That's the reality of the choice. But they're not honest about that, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to say that. Because, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it. If you build these things, it costs money. Who thinks that they can make the argument that we should build more affordable homes, or indeed rental homes, where you don't even get paid back the capital that you invest? They're saying build rental homes. Build for 250 million and then rent for £17 a week. That's what they're saying in an economy that they say is not doing well. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, what logic do they bring to the debate? Mr. Feetham realizes that this cannot be reasonable. I mean, I have at least that respect for his intellect. Mr. Speaker, the argument is not even how we finance things. The argument is whether or not these things go in the book, and whether or not there is a mortgage on whether or not there's a sale. Well, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the hospital, there is neither a mortgage, nor an INDF reference, nor anything. If honourable members wanted to make the argument as they have tried to make, barefaced deception of the public, that there is a mortgage and that people need to be worried about their homes, what do they say to the people sitting in beds in hospital, Mr. Speaker? Because the building belongs to the Royal Bank of Scotland and we pay a rent because that's how they structured it. Don't they fear that our patients are going to be turfed out? For goodness sake, Mr. Speaker, where is the logic of their position? Don't they realize, Mr. Speaker, that the great deal that Sir Peter Caruana did in relation to the hospital means that the hospital is owned by a bank and we have to pay a rent every month to keep the patients in their beds. That's the great deal that they did. If we were applying Mr. Clinton's standards, Mr. Speaker, in fact, in relation to that transaction, you know what we would say? We would say, Mr. Speaker, that transaction was brought about in circumstances where there was a relationship of consanguinity between people in the bank and people in the executive committee of the GSD. That creates a huge potential conflict of interest because the people in the bank were enriched by the decisions of the GSD, Mr. Speaker, in government. That conflict of interest was designed for people to line their pockets, Mr. Speaker. That's what we would say if we were applying their standard, Mr. Speaker. But we don't say that because we don't take that attitude, Mr. Speaker. We don't say that everyone is up to something and create innuendos. That's what they do, Mr. Speaker. We point out what we don't like about the deal, and Joe Bolsano pointed out what he didn't like about the deal in every question time. But we don't impugn the integrity of the people who were involved in the deal, despite the very close relationships that existed between the people who were on different sides of the transaction. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, when did we find out about that? When did we find out about the fact that there was going to be a new hospital which was not going to be owned by the government, it was going to be rented by the government at a huge cost, paying a huge amount, not of interest, but of rent? Well, Mr. Speaker, when we asked questions about it, because it wasn't disclosed by anyone. So, Mr. Speaker, by Mr. Clinton's lexicon, we uncovered the highest cost PFI deal done ever in Gibraltar's history, which involved relationships between people on the GSD and on the bank side of consanguinity and of proximity, which by their standards would relate to a conflict of interest after an investigation. And we discovered it, Mr. Speaker, because Joe Bolsano asked questions. Oh, by the way, Mr. Speaker, dealing with those issues, dealing with how we apply Mr. Clinton's yardstick to things. How does he feel about the 10 million that we lost on the Theatre Royal? On their watch. 10 million lost. Don't worry, I'll do all of the rest of the amounts that they lost on loans to OEM from taxpayers' money. I'll do all of that and see how he feels. How do they feel about GSD prudence, Mr. Speaker, when they are in imperium, when they are in government, Mr. Speaker? Surely, Mr. Speaker, the colonial bookkeeper cannot be happy about having lost 10 million, about having lost 7 million of taxpayers' money in loans, about relationships of consanguinity between bankers and people in the GSD executive that lead to the lining of pockets, Mr. Speaker. But he never answers those points, Mr. Speaker, because he's not here to answer questions. At question time, we're here to answer questions. But even in debate, Mr. Speaker, he does not deal with the issues in debate, Mr. Speaker. Why not, Mr. Speaker? Because they can't. They have absolutely no answer for the way in which they grossly, negligently lost millions of the taxpayers' money on loans and on bad property deals, and on a rotten deal on the hospital, Mr. Speaker. Maybe we should have a select committee to investigate that, Mr. Speaker. Maybe we will, Mr. Speaker. Maybe we'll have a select committee on more than just that, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. All of the things that I've heard honourable members say about Gibraltar's economy and Gibraltar's public finances, two separate things, not being the success that the government has demonstrated it is, are not just inaccurate, they can be demonstrated to be wrong by any measure of the economy. So if he doesn't like the surplus, let's look by the GDP. If he doesn't like the GDP or the surplus, let's look at employment. If he doesn't like any of those, let's look at the increase in revenue. Mr. Speaker, if he doesn't like any of those, let's look at the number of unemployed. And if he doesn't like any of that, just walk around this community, Mr. Speaker, and look at how it is being completely transformed, Mr. Speaker, by any measure. Mr. Speaker, are there issues out there? Of course there are issues out there. That's why it's absolutely right that we issue warnings to people. Jobu-san is issuing warnings to people in the same way as I'm issuing warnings to people, Mr. Speaker, because people have to realize that if we are going to continue to have it this good, we have to look after what we have today. But from that, Mr. Speaker, to say that the economy is on life support as a strap line for this debate is worse than ridiculous. They're just trying to prove a view, Mr. Speaker, but a view that they cannot prove anymore. This is not 1995. People see through them now. Mr. Speaker, the only thing on life support would have been their credibility. But in fact, Mr. Speaker, it's dead on arrival. It's dead on arrival when you look back at 1995 and you look at the fact that this is just a repeat of that deception. Of course, things could turn adversely on Brexit. I was saying that in the context of my introduction, but they don't seem to want to hear the arguments. Of course, therefore, although this is an election and the GSD style would be to give away things at an election budget, we have not done so. We've structured a careful budget, Mr. Speaker. And I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, that what they're doing is talking amongst themselves because they can't handle the truth, Mr. Speaker. They can't handle that what they have done is to really demonstrate how ridiculous their arguments are by simply dusting down 1995 and doing it all over again. Of course, we don't know what this year will bring, Mr. Speaker. That's why this is called an estimate and why it's a conservative estimate. That's why the surplus is conservatively estimated, like every year. Don't they know that we estimate 20 million of surplus, but we've ended up with 85? That's why it's a conservative estimate, because we don't know what's around the corner, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he didn't even spot this allegedly competent person in finance didn't even spot where the Brexit provision was. Another thing that Albert Isola had to demonstrate to him, Mr. Speaker, in the course of the demonstration, that much of what he says is utterly unreliable. Okay, it's not called a Brexit provision. What does he want? A flashing light and a hand pointing to things. Mr. Speaker, maybe what he needs is a magnifying glass in order to see where things are in the estimate, Mr. Speaker. Instead, Mr. Speaker, what he does is he shoots off, half-cocked, as usual, and gets it absolutely and demonstrably wrong. Well, Mr. Speaker, but he is, however, not the only one who gets things wrong in the opposition, although he is the one who gets them most wrong. Also, entirely wrong, and obviously not up to the job, is the current official leader of the opposition. The official leader of the official opposition, as I suppose I should call him, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell him honestly and genuinely, he can believe me if he likes or not, that I do not dislike him. I really do not dislike him. And, in politics, there are some people you just can't help but dislike. It's normal, like in everyday life. But I do not dislike him, Mr. Speaker. But I have to tell him, and I'm almost telling him honestly as a counsellor, so he doesn't put himself through it again, that was, Mr. Speaker, the weakest ever budget response by a leader of the opposition in parliamentary history, bar none. He has outdone even himself last year. And I thought that was impossible, Mr. Speaker, because last year he was abysmal. Utterly abysmal. Oh, by the way, Mr. Speaker, he was the one who said that the economy was on life support. He, who was dead on arrival as an incumbent for leader of the opposition, said that the economy was on life support. He doesn't seem to be doing badly out of the economy, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased for him, and I hope he continues to do very well. I should say, by the way, that at last, they have replied to the motion on backbenchers, Mr. Speaker. After I said in my speech that they hadn't, they have now finally replied to us on the motion on backbenchers. He tells us, Mr. Speaker, that because of Brexit, we have to be more circumspect in our spending. But then he tells us that we haven't done enough and that we're letting people down. I mean, it's such a basic contradiction that you would have thought that in writing his intervention, or at least whoever wrote it for him in writing the intervention, would have realized that the contradiction was utterly blatant, Mr. Speaker. He talked about an economic and physical separation from the continent. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't see a tug strong enough to tow us away from Europe. There isn't going to be a physical separation from the continent. And the idea that there is clear blue water between Joe Bossano and the rest of the government, because Joe Bossano doesn't comment on things which are not his portfolio competence, and I don't comment on things which are Joe Bossano's portfolio competence, is not even an argument. It's not even a weak argument. It's just not even an argument, Mr. Speaker. And all of these political placebos that people say to each other at parties were strung together to make a speech. The champagne socialism. Well, Mr. Speaker, look, as a socialist, I take it very badly that people think that there are drinks which are not accessible to us. I tend to drink Coke Zero these days, or water. But is it that the honourable gentleman is saying that socialists are not allowed to drink champagne? We're not allowed to celebrate an election win, even by 68%, because the minute that we sip from that nectar, we stop being socialists, we become something else, Mr. Speaker. I thought they were in a competition with us to be more socialist. Another argument that Joe Bossano has won. Not only is everybody now against the Brussels Agreement, not everybody now accept the golden rules, now everybody wants to be a socialist, Mr. Speaker. Well, I hope there's no champagne, Mr. Speaker, around next time they have an annual general meeting and they get more than 20 people in. Goodness, Mr. Speaker. We failed young people. We won't have a highly skilled workforce. These things, I mean, I've got replies to all of them, but is it worth replying, Mr. Speaker? It's not even worth replying to these things. We have the most highly skilled workforce in Europe. That's the problem, that we don't have technical people, but we have the most highly skilled workforce in Europe because we send 70% of our people away to do degrees. People will put us in the right place, and they have given us our roles here. Well, yes, obviously, Mr. Speaker. And by a margin of more than 2-1, they put us here and them there. That's the reality of what our roles are. People are entitled to know what your spending is. Well, Mr. Speaker, £676 million of spending is in this book, and they say there's nothing there. And then, Mr. Speaker, he went on, we must protect our elderly and our young people, we must make good use of our land. And I thought, hang on a minute, that's my speech from last year that he's reading back at me. He was saying to us that we must do all the things we've told him we're doing. Well, we must give value for money to our people. Well, Mr. Speaker, he might want to give a charitable donation of the whole of his salary as a member of parliament then, because frankly, that's the only way the people are going to get value for money from him. That must be why the financial secretary was wily enough to tell me that I had to raise the gift aid to £10,000 so that he could get rid of it in 4 shots, Mr. Speaker. I don't know whether I should bother, Mr. Speaker, put people through having to listen to my responses to his speech, because there was nothing of substance there. Look, Mr. Speaker, he said that he had seen Joe Bossano on YouTube in the 1980s in America, and that that I had plagiarized him, and that he wanted to commend the younger Joe Bossano to the current Joe Bossano. Mr. Speaker, the things that Joe Bossano was saying in that YouTube video were exactly the same things that he said about our land and our people in his first budget speech as Chief Minister in 1988, which is the one I analysed last year, which is the one I paraphrased this year and summarised. Or hasn't he made the connection, Mr. Speaker? And apparently, Mr. Speaker, we are giving away our land, which is the jewel in the crown, to the few for the rich. Speaker, to the few for the rich. We built more affordable homes on our land than they did, and yet we're giving away to the few for the rich. We're creating more land, and we're giving away to the few to the rich. Our development plan gives away to the few, to the rich. But, Mr. Speaker, it's their development plan. It's the 10-year life of the development plan dated 2009. So what's he talking about? Or did he have a PDP moment there, criticizing the GSD? And Victoria Keys is just for the few. Well, we get half of the land and 20% of the company. For the first time in history, as I told the House, because Joe Bolsano said we must negotiate a fifth of that company belonging to the taxpayer, for the first time in history, the taxpayer is going to make something from a development. And when the taxpayer makes something, it invests what it makes for the many, not the few, Mr. Speaker. So can they please get it right? And all these horrible buildings that he rails about, Mr. Speaker, all the horrible buildings that they approved in their secret DPC, that's the reality. That we deserve an open view of spending. Again, £676 million in the book, which they say, I mean, maybe they just can't be bothered to read. They don't want to do the work, and that's why they say there's nothing there. Governing Gibraltar means making tough decisions which are fair and open, he said to me, Mr. Speaker. Seriously, Mr. Speaker? Seriously? Every time I say no to something, they take the side of the people I've said no to. A mí me pertenece culture is a bad thing? When somebody comes and says, I'm entitled to something, and I say, no, you're not, they say, que poca vergüenza, you should have been told yes. For goodness sake, Mr. Speaker. This budget does nothing for families, he said. How can this budget do nothing for families, Mr. Speaker? It puts up all the tax allowances. It puts up all the scholarships. It's been welcomed by the Disability Society. It's been welcomed by Unite the Union. It's been welcomed by the GGCA in a circular to all its members. It's been welcomed by the GTA and ASUWT. The minimum wage is up, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it's up a third in my time. And we do nothing for families. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, they're going to vote against all of that. They're going to vote against all of that. I think the problem, Mr. Speaker, is that this does nothing for his family because it doesn't get them any closer to his obvious ambition of power. He said, Mr. Speaker, that we have hidden the true level of debt because he talked about the 300 million investment, he talked about the 400 million in Credit Finance Company Limited, the 400 million of gross debt. But why did he talk about all of that, Mr. Speaker? Because I've told him about all of it. So how is it hidden? How can something that we are talking about and totting up and having different views about how it should be dealt with in accounting terms, how can that be said to be hidden, Mr. Speaker? It's not in the book. No, it's not in the book, for reasons we have explained, and I'll go into why Sir Peter says that it should not be in the book. Saint Peter said it should not be in the book. But it's not hidden, Mr. Speaker. Tripe, he said. Gallo. Carne como gallo. Tripe, he said, Mr. Speaker. Tripe is what came out of his mouth for 40 minutes, Mr. Speaker. Better he had kept it all in. But maybe, Mr. Speaker, his attack might be slightly different. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, he's not of GSD stock. He's of PDP stock. So maybe he is actually wanting to put clear blue water between Sir Peter Caruana's practices and his GSD. But, Mr. Speaker, given that he's not of GSD stock because he's PDP stock, Mr. Sobal is not GSD stock because he's PDP stock, and Mr. Feetham was said by the founder of the GSD not to be GSD stock, well, frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't think they've got enough stock to make a soup. No more GSD soup is possible because we haven't got the stock. And he made the same mistake about the £1,000 nominal line. He said everybody's worse off. We didn't listen to the young people who couldn't get a job. Well, Mr. Speaker, what, the 33 that I reported haven't got a job? Even Mr. Feetham later on in the debate, through gritted teeth, congratulated us on having got unemployment down. But the leader of the opposition, because that is apparently what he is, Mr. Speaker, the official leader of the official opposition, said that we were not doing enough for young people. We're not listening to addicts, he said, Mr. Speaker. Of course we're listening to addicts. What we're not doing, Mr. Speaker, is allowing ourselves to fall into the trap of allowing people to abuse addicts, to record them, to try and get those videos to go viral, and to somehow in that way put pressure on the government. And he falls into a trap if he does that, Mr. Speaker. But this was all just high-level placebos. The classic, the final cherry on the cake, Mr. Speaker, was when he said, reform, referendum, remain. That phrase that you got your friend Alistair Campbell to come up with. Mr. Speaker, Alistair Campbell would take that very badly. He's paid to come up with much better than that. I came up with that entirely myself, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I felt an emotion I didn't think I would ever feel when the Honourable Mr. Phillips was halfway through. I really wanted Mr. Feetham to grab the microphone and deliver the Leader of the Opposition speech. I never thought I would feel that emotion, rooting for Danny to once more take over the GSD. It was that bad. Then he told us that what we should be negotiating in Brexit is that we should have continued freedom of movement and access to the single market, whilst at the same time we should tear up the tax treaty with Spain and the memorandums of understanding. He told us it wasn't possible 2 years ago to do that, Mr. Speaker, and now he tells us it's the standard by which we must be judged and what we must achieve. This was just nonsense. In one part of his speech, he said, we need to be positive and speak loudly. I have not heard such utter puff, Mr. Speaker, in politics in all my life. But the tax treaty is a success for Spain, a surrender for Gibraltar. The honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, is a political shyster, and he is going to be found out. The cost of running government has gone up 76% or £56 million a month. Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, what would he cut? If he's concerned it's gone up, what would he cut? What would Elliot Phillips cut? Would he stop the salary of the nurses or of the teachers? Would he tell the teachers he's not going to give them a pay cut? Or pay rise, sorry. Would he instead tell the teachers, sorry boys, instead of 46% up on the M1 scale, you're going 25% down? Would he do that because he says that we've gone up 76% and that's too much? Mr. Speaker, the average increase in recurrent expenditure under the GSLP Liberals in the past 8 years is 7% per annum. The average increase in recurrent expenditure under the GSD is 17.8% per annum. Maybe he's just putting distance between himself, as a PDP guy, and the GSD. Mr. Speaker, I really was left thinking as he spoke of that great Meatloaf hit, I want my money back. I want my money back. This is costing the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, he says that at the May Day rally, I had to be scurried off by my personal protection team. Nothing could be further from the truth. I went to the Union May Day rally knowing there were people who wanted to remonstrate with me, because it's my obligation to be there when people want to remonstrate with me, to hear their arguments, to discuss with them with passion, not just to agree, to make the tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, to put the taxpayer's point, not to run away as they do every time that there's a serious argument. But it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that if he were ever in a position of responsibility, his attitude would be to bottle it, to run away from the argument. He wouldn't face the music, and he's just admitted it. Real training and real skills, he said, that we need. Well, I suppose, Mr. Speaker, on the whole minimum wage, not just half, like they paid when they were there last time. And then, Mr. Speaker, as he was coming to the end, he said, of course, on public finances, Roy Clinton will speak. And on the context, Daniel Feetham will speak. But, Mr. Speaker, neither of them are the leader of the opposition. Both of them have been rejected by the GSD. Roy Clinton got less votes than a guy who wasn't entitled to stand for election as leader under their constitution. And although he'd rented magnificent offices for the Clinton campaign, Mr. Speaker, another great and prudent decision. And he was rejected. And Daniel Feetham, Mr. Speaker, well, that's history. For now, at least. He is the leader of the opposition. And he didn't talk on public finances, and he didn't talk about the context. He should do a T-level on politics, Mr. Speaker. And they are the biggest fans now, Mr. Speaker, of everything they said about Joe Bossano. But don't they realize, Mr. Speaker, doesn't he realize that Joe Bossano, the hatred of Joe Bossano, the character assassination of Joe Bossano is the glue that stuck the GSD together. Now that they love him, they're falling apart. And he said that we should have fairness in housing, Mr. Speaker. What fairness? Favoring those who buy 100% of an affordable home over those who buy 50%? That's fairness. So if you can afford less, you choose second. If you can afford 100%, you choose first. That's fairness in housing, a la GSD. Very unsocialist, Mr. Speaker. A few bubbles of champagne must have crossed his lips at some stage, Mr. Speaker. We need to create more training for our people in the gaming industry, otherwise they won't succeed. Doesn't he know, Mr. Speaker, that out of 30 companies, two of them already have CEOs who are Gibraltarians? That is magnificent. These are two excellent examples of Gibraltarian ability, of Gibraltarian diligence and skill. CEOs from Gibraltar. His speech was pitiful. It was pathetic. When he looks back at it, he will be embarrassed, Mr. Speaker. The biggest crisis in housing in our history, he says. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you woke up yesterday and thought that the day before everyone had a home and this day they were on a housing waiting list, you might say that. But anybody who has been here for long enough will know what the list was like in 88, what the list was like in 1996, and what the list was like again in 2011. Yes, there's a lot of people waiting for the 1 RKB. But there's a lot of people there who are couples who are both down for a 1 RKB. Or doesn't he know that? And what about all the spending we've had to do repairing the estates that they created? What about the need to repair the Mid-Harbour estate, which is literally breaking apart? And by the way, Mr. Speaker, when he says they're selling the purchasers 50%. No, we're not. No, we're not. We're selling our 50%, Mr. Speaker, not the purchasers' 50%. Or don't they understand that the ownership of the remaining 50% remains with the government in what Sir Peter called dead money, capital that will not be realized, Mr. Speaker? It's not housing that's broken, Mr. Speaker. It's the GSD that's broken. They are broken in half, maybe even in quarters. They are torn asunder, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady left. The Honourable Mr. Yamas left, came back, and just told us he's about to leave again. They're being propped up by the PDP. Indeed, they're being led by the PDP in Parliament and outside. And if it's not the PDP, it's the Labour Party. The takeover is complete. And of course, Mr. Speaker, Slim Shady never stood up. As usual. The nomad is always such a disappointment. In fact, maybe it's time for Slim Shady to shut up, not stand up. And if he needs to better understand this book, Mr. Speaker, he needs to understand it's a business plan for the spending of £676 million of our nation's money. And for them not to even bother to scrutinize it is utterly ridiculous. Who sold the crown jewels, Mr. Speaker? They sold the crown jewels. They sold all the post-war properties that people were prepared to buy, sold. If Mr. Clinton were right and we had done a mortgage over them, doesn't he understand that in a mortgage, you get the property back in the end? It's the best way of keeping to your crown jewels. If you sell it, you alienate it for good. Thank goodness that Samantha Sacramento and the Financial Secretary have worked a mechanism for us to be able to buy all of that back, Mr. Speaker. They sold every single post-war tenancy that people would be prepared to buy, Mr. Speaker. So if they say, Mr. Speaker, that the crown jewels are in play, they lost 200 of the diamonds in the crown jewels, Mr. Speaker. That's what they did. That's what they did. And that, Mr. Speaker, is half an estate, half a rental estate. So they tell us to build a new rental estate. They alienated half a rental estate, indeed a whole small rental estate, by selling it to people. Those houses are no longer available for people on the housing waiting list because they've been bought. So if you buy a house, you can give it to whoever you like. We cannot give it to the person who would next be entitled. They sold the diamonds in the crown jewels. Thank goodness we have the wherewithal, the financing, the ability, the successful economic performance to buy those properties back and to put them back to the use of those who most need housing in our community, those who most need rentals, Mr. Speaker. That was bad for the rental stock. And if arrears have hit a brick wall, Mr. Speaker, because we've done all of the work that we can do but continue to do more, it's not the brick wall that it hit, Mr. Speaker, when they undid the Central Arrears Unit. Talk about creating the a mí me pertenece culture. They stopped chasing people who didn't pay. How can they accuse us of somehow nurturing the a mí me pertenece culture? They planted the seed and they watered it and they covered it in their usual compost, Mr. Speaker. And everybody knows what compost is made of, Mr. Speaker. We heard enough of it in the past 72 hours. We won't vote for this book, Mr. Speaker, because it is not clear, it is not fair, it is not accurate, and it is a gross dereliction on our part if we support it. You know, Mr. Speaker, that was his final moment. That was the strength of his submission. And it was, Mr. Speaker, an absolute puff. It was vapor, Mr. Speaker. It was levante. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that although they called him Eliot, they didn't think they were calling him Eliot after General Eliot. There was a man who stood and fought in the siege of Gibraltar. It's made of real metal. This Eliot is not made of any of that. But even then, Mr. Speaker, I don't dislike him, as I told him when I started. But if they say these things, I have to reply. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, turning now to Mr. Clinton, who delivered, Mr. Phillips told us, the address on public finances. I'm going to reply to Mr. Clinton and Mr. Feetham together in some instances, because some of what they said crossed, contradicted, tried to find support for some of the arguments. And of course, as Mr. Phillips said, one was going to talk on public finance, the other one was going to give the context. So it's Mr. Phillips who leads for the opposition, but actually the submissions that a leader of the opposition would make were made by Mr. Clinton and Mr. Feetham separately. Okay, so I'll have to deal with them in some instances together. Some of their arguments, as I say, Mr. Speaker, support each other, some of them contradict each other. Quite an interesting tag team to follow in an intellectual way, Mr. Speaker. Working together, seeing Mr. Feetham and Mr. Clinton working together, bumbling along with their arguments. It's a bit like watching Laurel and Hardy, Mr. Speaker. I won't say which is which, Mr. Speaker. But I will say this. They would have done better if, like Laurel and Hardy, they had stayed in the silent era, Mr. Speaker. Maybe next year they will reply to me, said Mr. Clinton, with not a hint of arrogance, Mr. Speaker. Maybe next year they will reply to me. He already sees himself here, Mr. Speaker. He already sees himself with the deception of 1995 updated,
the optical illusion becoming the mirage, people deceived, and him swept into power. He already sees it, Mr. Speaker. I wonder whether he's chosen his suit for the day when he will be sworn in as a government minister, Mr. Speaker, because he already sees himself here giving the speech on the budget for public finance, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, he could become a minister. He could become a minister. We take nothing for granted. We are humbly going to put our record before the people of Gibraltar when the election comes. And they will make the choice, and they will make the decision. But that is why today I have to deconstruct his arguments to ensure that the people of Gibraltar make a decision based on the truth. Whatever decision the people of Gibraltar make, it will be the right decision as far as I'm concerned, even if I disagree with it. But they must make it based on the truth, not based on a deception. Mr. Speaker, when he said that he could be here giving the speech, he gave himself away. By the mouth dieth the fish, Mr. Speaker. Because everything that we have seen, everything that we have heard, Mr. Speaker, is an attempt to get here, not an attempt to do a fair and balanced analysis of the estimates of expenditure. It's a tactical attempt to go back to the deception of 1995, to denigrate today's numbers, to ignore success, and to try and persuade some people that for that reason they should support them. It's a mirage, Mr. Speaker. The only mirage, Mr. Speaker, is the mirage of competence on his part, as I will show, Mr. Speaker, when I demonstrate the huge level of incompetence that he has brought to this debate in the way that he has done the analysis. But not just for this year. His incompetence is legion, Mr. Speaker. And even Sir Peter Caruana will have cause to pick up the phone and ask him, Roy, Paraya, to stop with these new big ideas that he brings, voting against the budget, undoing the surplus by counting the corporate spend. I think he will get a call and he will say, look, you're not just doing down your own reputation, you're doing down all of our reputations. I told the House, Mr. Speaker, what they said in 1995. I've got it here. Freddy Vasquez had said that this was all an optical illusion. And Joe Bossano, replying to him, said, the thing that he has just admitted to us 5 minutes ago is the only thing that in this book we can take credit for, is what he said in 1992 was not real. The optical illusion then, Mr. Speaker, had been the reclamation. Not real and created by spending borrowed money. The Honourable Mr. Vasquez has told the House today that we have got a crippling mountain of debt, and in one of their political broadcasts last year, they said that we had borrowed over £100 million, and it is not true. They know it is not true. And remember what I said before that Elliot Phillips had said about the economy being on life support? Well, another thing that Freddy Vasquez had said was that we had a wrecked economy. Wrecked economy, economy on life support. Mirage, optical illusion. 100 million, 1 billion. It's all the same, Mr. Speaker. All of the same, Mr. Speaker. Just adjusted for inflation. But I dare say there's one big difference, Mr. Speaker. Danny Feetham did not agree with the analysis in 1995. Because it was being done of the GSLP government. It was being done of the work that Joe Bossano, Juan Carlos Perez, Michael Feetham, and others had done, which did Gibraltar proud. The difference is that Daniel Feetham now prosecutes the same case that Freddy Vasquez prosecuted against that GSLP government in 1995, with the same terminology and with the same attempt at sleight of hand. The economy on life support today was the wrecked economy then. Mr. Speaker, there are more repeats on the GSD playbook than there are GBC at the weekend. All the things they praise Joe Bossano for now, Mr. Speaker, the great economic performance, were the things that they were knocking him for. It's incredible. You couldn't make it up, Mr. Speaker, this GSD politics. They even mocked, as recently as 3.5 years ago, not 30 years ago, not 25 years ago, not 20 years ago, not 8 years ago, as recently as 3.5 years ago, they mocked his predictions on the GDP again. Mr. Clinton and Mr. Hammond went on television and said, you'll never achieve that. Not only have we achieved it a year early, Maybe that's why they're converts, Mr. Speaker. They had a Damascene conversion on the way to the House of Assembly for this budget debate. Dan más vuelta con trompo. They really do turn more than a spinning top, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, if they think that Joe Bossano is siding with them and not with the GSLP, Mr. Speaker, why don't they offer him membership of the GSD? See what he says. Or why don't they try and come and join the GSLP? See what he says. Because they know that one of them is barred for life. I'm starting to wonder, Mr. Speaker. Whether or not actually I might want the GSD to survive for another 25 years. I always thought they were too dangerous and that they should be got rid of. But actually, reluctantly, I might take the view that they should be the ones to survive. Because maybe in 25 years, they'll be saying great things of me. They're trying to assassinate me now, but maybe they'll be saying that I'm the best economist since sliced bread in 25 years, given the way that things are changing. But some of them, at least some of them, are making exactly the same sort of distasteful and untrue allegations that they were making in 1995-96. Not just the ones that I've referred to. They're creating innuendos and specters of impropriety, etc., etc. But history shows that the truth will out. Mr. Clinton says, Mr. Speaker, he tells the general public in Gibraltar that they are being cruelly deceived. The truth is the government is running 2 sets of books and we are only being shown a fraction. He knows that is not true, Mr. Speaker. But if it were true, it would be exactly the same fraction that was brought to this House by the GSD under Sir Peter Caruana. The only fiction, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that he delivers only half of his speech. He delivers the half of the speech which analyzes the economy in the deceptive way that he wants to analyze it. He tries to give a pessimistic picture of the economy, but he doesn't deliver the second part of his speech, which is, and therefore, if I was in government, I would stop the program to build schools. I would stop the program to build a new CPCC, a new PCC. I would stop the program to build new houses. He doesn't want to tell us that fraction of his speech, the next logical part of his speech. The budget system is not fit for purpose. That's what he said. Mr. Speaker, well, it's a good thing he's come to the House to tell us that. It's a good thing, thank God, Mr. Speaker, that after 50 years, this House has been told that its budgetary systems are not fit for purpose. What would we do without him? Well, Mr. Speaker, it's as unfit for purpose as when Bob Belisa was here, as unfit for purpose as when Joshua Hassan was here, as unfit for purpose as when you were here, when Joe Bossano was here, when Sir Peter Caruana was here. As unfit for purpose, nothing has changed. Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. They called me unfit to govern in September 2011. On the 9th of December 2011, the people decided otherwise. Now they're saying that the book is unfit. At the next election, the people will show them that they think otherwise, I am sure. And why is the book unfit? Why is the budget system unfit? Why do they have to vote against the budget? For one simple reason. Because since coming into government, his phrase, since coming into government, the GSLP Liberals are diverting capital projects into companies. Mr. Speaker, that is a sick joke. It's a sick joke. He's been here now for 3 years. He might have said it the first year. In the first year when he said something like it, I did the analysis for him, showing how the GSD had put all the capital projects for companies. He said it again the second year. And I told him again. He said it again last year. And I told him again. He seems to like to crash his car against the same brick wall every single year. But just like Gilbert Liquidi nailed him on his mistakes on recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure in the university, just like Albert Isola nailed him yesterday on his mistake, his beginner's mistake on the £1,000 nominal line, I am going to demonstrate that the reason that he has said that the surplus should disappear is one, that has greater consequences for the record of the GSD than for us. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, in every year that they were in government, let's just take the last 8 anyway, the GSD used the company structure to finance capital projects in every single year. In fact, Mr. Speaker, between 2001 and 2011, they spent 808 million in capital projects. That's a lot. 808 million. Remember that Mr. Feetham says that I've spent too much, because Mr. Feetham says you've spent 750 million pounds on capital projects. They spent, Mr. Speaker, they spent 808. Mr. Speaker, if we gross it up, that's probably over £1 billion now, if we total the inflation, of which almost 300 million was spent outside the book. 300 million was spent through companies without passing through the government accounts, to use Mr. Clinton's description, which I don't share. So, Mr. Speaker, why should we have less faith this year than we had in all the years that they were in government? And now he raises, Mr. Speaker, that this is all unconstitutional. But, Mr. Speaker, why is it unconstitutional now? It was constitutional when the person who was doing it was the draftsman of the Constitution. One of the things that Mr. Feetham tells us is one of Sir Peter's greatest achievements is the Constitution. And yet he stands there now with Mr. Clinton and says that Mr. Caruana, Mr. Peter, was in breach of the Constitution for the 5 years between 2006 and 2011 at least, unless they're referring to a part of the Constitution that goes back even further to the 1969 Constitution. You couldn't make up this nonsense, these contradictions. Laurel and Hardy would do so much better to have stayed in the silent era. How can the greatest Gibraltarian of our time be accused by the same people who elevate him to that standard of acting unconstitutionally on the key issue, which is public finance? Mr. Speaker, they say that these transactions that we're doing by putting capital spending through companies produce an unacceptable distortion that requires them to vote against the budget. But in 2011, in the general election, in 2007, in 2003, in 2001, all of those things were prudent financial management. So recurrent expenditure goes up too much because it's going up 7%. That's terrible. But when it went up 17.8% under them, it was prudent financial management. Using companies for capital spending is terrible. But when they were doing it, it was prudent financial management. When we create a reclamation, it's a rat-infested place. When they have the same reclamation, with not one more grain of sand, it's Sovereign Bay. My goodness, talk about do as I say and not as I do. Well, I'm going to do an analysis now, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to do an analysis now that even though he is nervous and he is trying to pretend that he's not listening, even though he doesn't want to hear it, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Clinton should listen to, and he should try to find a reply to, although there is none, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know that they don't like the fact that I'm replying to them and that I'm going into granular detail. I know that they don't like the fact that I have found the arguments which they are trying to hide, which demonstrate that this is a deception, Mr. Speaker. But they should deal with them. They should have the respect for the people of Gibraltar to listen to the answer to the spurious deception that they have tried to create, and then deal with the answer. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that there may be something they want to say, but they should say it about the answer. They shouldn't put the same argument again. Listen to what Sir Peter had to say in respect of borrowing through companies. This is a letter from St. Peter to his disciples in 2005. Construction of the government's new housing scheme, Waterport Terraces, gets underway very soon. It was delivered many years late, honourable members will recall. It will be funded mainly via the companies. In 2005, Mr. Feetham was not sitting here. In 2008, he was. In 2008, Sir Peter, in a new encyclical to his disciples, said this, Mr. Speaker, was with Daniel Feetham sitting next to him, with his young apprentice just there. In addition to capital expenditure through the Improvement and Development Fund, a total of 48.2 million has been expended through the government companies, Mr. Speaker. Wow. Wow. And you know what Mr. Feetham did, Mr. Speaker? Did he get up and said, I'm not voting for that? Did he get up and say, this is disgraceful, it's unconstitutional? No. I'll tell him what he did, Mr. Speaker. That's what he did, Mr. Speaker. Because at that stage, Sir Peter didn't do what he sometimes also did to him, which was, shut up, and tell him to sit down. Remember that, Mr. Speaker? Remember that? With a bit more authority and gravitas, of course. And in 2009, Mr. Speaker, in 2009, so this is now the New Testament. This is, the end, Mr. Speaker. With Mr. Feetham sitting next to him, in all, he said, in all, during the last 12 years, we have invested a total of 427 million on capital projects, of which 278 million has been incurred through the INDF. It's a lot of money. And 149 million through the government-owned companies. And what did Mr. Feetham do? That's how he voted for spending through government companies, Mr. Speaker. So in that time, with Mr. Feetham sitting here as a young apprentice, Mr. Speaker, not a very good one, but as a young apprentice, this was no longer a web of companies and hiding the transactions. This was magnificent, prudent management of our nation's affairs. And why is it wrong if I do exactly the same thing? If this government does exactly the same thing? Well, Mr. Yamas has told us, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Yamas, to be fair to him, with his disarming honesty, has told us what is wrong if we do it compared to when they did it. He said, and he's nailed his colors to who he is and why he was in the GSD and which side of the many wings in the GSD he was in. He said, because I had faith in Sir Peter. He's the one who should call him Saint Peter. But look, Mr. Speaker, that is an article of faith. It's fair enough. If you say, I trust Sir Peter to do things which are hidden, but I don't trust you, I have to accept that. It's a fair argument. They might think he's a man of probity. You are a man who likes wine, women, and song, and fast cars, and I'm not prepared to trust you. But look, they'd be wrong. They'd be wrong. But it's an argument. But don't say, this system is worthy, and this system, with the same system, is not worthy. Say, as Mr. Yamas has said, look, I trust him and I don't trust you. Fair enough. That's how you vote at the general election. But don't come here pretending to make an argument. I cannot argue with Mr. Yamas's article of faith, although I do appreciate, given his actions and his first paragraph in his speech, that there are very few like him left in the GSD. Mr. Speaker, is it that I have to apply for membership of the yacht club in order to be trusted by them? Is it that if I'm a member of the yacht club, I can do spending through companies, but if I'm just a boy born in El Calpe, I am not able to do exactly the same thing that Sir Peter did? Is that the issue? Is it modern racism, Mr. Speaker? Is it modern racism? Yes, yes, no. Mr. Isola is, but it's not Mr. Isola making the argument. I'm not suggesting that honourable members are members. I'm suggesting that Sir Peter is. Because they trust Sir Peter. They trust Sir Peter, who's a member of the yacht club, but they don't trust me. I'm not suggesting that any of them is, Mr. Speaker. Maybe none of them would make it. You never know, Mr. Speaker. They've got enough black balls for them and everybody else, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure Mr. Isola wouldn't blackball any of them. He's a bigger man, Mr. Speaker. He forgives them for all the nonsense that they say, all of the innuendos. But I'm not a member of the yacht club. But if their member of the yacht club does it, it's fine. If the boy from El Calpe does it, it's disgraceful. This is modern racism, Mr. Speaker. It's neighborhoodism. Or is it because Sir Peter was of Maltese extraction and Sir Joe and I are of Italian extraction? Because I'm left trying to work out what is the different characteristic that we bring to the party that makes it unacceptable when we do it, not to Mr. Yamas, who has been very clear in his view, but to them, Mr. Speaker. Is it that they're condemning us because of our Italian descent? Is this Genoese? No, is this is modern colonialism, Mr. Speaker, that Feetham and Clinton, two English names, will not accept that Picardo and Bossano should do the things that they did. This is modern colonialism. Do they want us to call them Buana? Will they not give way to the Jefe, just like the Foreign and Development Secretary, the Financial Development Secretary did in 1988? Mr. Speaker, or is it, Mr. Speaker, that they do not realize their contradictions, Mr. Speaker? Don't they see, Mr. Speaker, that they are the ones changing colors every day, every year, in every budget debate, depending on where they are sitting, they say one thing or do another? Mr. Speaker, they are left to look utterly, politically incompetent and ridiculous by calling unconstitutional that which they supported and encouraged when they were in government. In fact, they raise the hyperbole so much, they say it's unconstitutional today. They said it was prudent financial management then. Slim said that they had left a golden legacy, Mr. Speaker. But it's all a sham and a mirage under us. Proper, transparent accounting under them, untransparent and unfit for purpose under us. Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Feetham has gone from GSLP to GSD. He's gone from praising Joe Bossano to calling companies a web of companies to now praising Sir Joe Bossano again. He then went to the GSD and praised Sir Peter. He was praising company borrowing until 2011, and now he's calling it unconstitutional. Mr. Speaker, he has become a veritable political Boy George, Mr. Speaker. And I kick myself for not having realized it sooner. He is, Mr. Speaker, the Karma chameleon of the 1980s hit. And the lyrics are perfect, Mr. Speaker. And I say to him, in the words of that song, to this political Boy George, to this Karma chameleon, if I listen to your lies, would you say, I am a man without conviction. I am a man who doesn't know how to sell a contradiction. I come and go, I come and go. From one party to another, from one argument to another. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. But it's not just him. Laurel and Hardy together are the Karma chameleon. They are the political culture club that we have, Mr. Speaker. But look at what he was praising in 2009. Listen to what Sir Peter said in 2009. Last year, in addition to the Improvement and Development Fund spending of 39 million, a further 70 million was spent through the government-owned companies, making a total for the year of 109 million. Did they get those numbers? Did they get those numbers, Mr. Speaker? I think it's only the Honourable Lady can bear to listen, because I think they realise that they've been caught out, and they must have that feeling in the pit of their stomach when you are caught out and you think, oh my God, they found me out. Mr. Speaker, 39 million through the INDF, 70 million through the government companies. 65% of all capital spending in 2009 was through the companies. So how do Laurel and Hardy feel now, Mr. Speaker, that one of them needs to go off to do a Boy George? How does Boy Roy feel, Mr. Speaker? Because you see, Mr. Feetham was voting for that. At least Mr. Clinton was not here, Mr. Speaker. How does that make Laurel and Hardy look? Maybe, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Clinton will go to the other verse of Karma Chameleon and sing it to Mr. Feetham. Don't you hear your wicked words every day? And you used to be so sweet, I heard you say. My love is an addiction. When we cling, our love is strong. when you go, you're gone forever, except he never goes, Mr. Speaker. He strings along, Mr. Speaker, because he told us he was going, but he's staying. I think Mr. Clinton devised all of these arguments when Mr. Feetham said he was resigning and leaving the party, because otherwise he makes these arguments saying all of this is wrong, with the guy sitting next to him who said, aye. It's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. There can't be much love lost between them. In the end, Laurel and Hardy broke up, Mr. Speaker. Just like Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, in the end, they broke up, Mr. Speaker. Just like Smith and Jones, Mr. Speaker, they broke up in the end, but they do look pretty ridiculous from where I'm standing. They look pretty ridiculous. To the whole nation now, Mr. Speaker, to the whole nation, they just sound like men without conviction who cannot sell a contradiction. They come and go and they string along, Mr. Speaker, but they are not leaders. They are just political hip shooters who don't care what damage they do to our nation with their irreconcilable statements. They can laugh, Mr. Speaker, but deep down, this is damaging our nation. It's damaging trust in politics, and it is bad, Mr. Speaker. They don't, I think, sometimes even realize. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, in 2010, Sir Peter told the House that he was going to spend another £47 million through the companies. And in 2011, an election year, £63 million spent in the companies. All of it outside the book, according to them. That's the way they refer to it, outside the book. All of it in keeping with the chameleon Mr. Clinton standards, scrutiny not available to the House. All of it, according to Mr. Clinton, unconstitutional. All of it, by the way, all of it, by his standards, annihilating their surpluses. All of it. For every single one of those years. Or is it that he didn't bother to think this through when he was crafting his clever little argument, Mr. Speaker, on his grubby notes for the debate? Didn't he think through that what he was doing goes to the heart of the argument, Mr. Speaker? Not just this argument, the historic argument in the moral play that has been played out in this place since 1995 between the GSD and the GSLP. It goes to the heart of it, to the argument of the optical illusion in 1995, to the arguments about big lie elections in 2011 and in 2015. Didn't he work that out? They say this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Clinton said this to the nation in his budget address. I noticed at one stage, Mr. Speaker, he was up against the match between the GFA and Ireland, and 33 people were watching online. The unemployed, Mr. Speaker. He said this: if you had spent what you have spent through the companies, through the Improvement and Development Fund, through the book, then your surplus would disappear. That's what he said. That's what he said. He said that on Monday evening, Mr. Speaker. This is key. This is key. Because it is the edifice upon which not just his argument, but Freddie Vasquez's argument, Sir Peter's argument against the GSD, every single one of their arguments, their non-vote for the budget, hangs on this. If you do that spending through the companies that you've done, through the book instead, in the INDF, then you don't have a surplus. Therefore, your record surplus is not there. Therefore, it is a mirage or optical illusion. Therefore, we are not doing economically well. Therefore, our public finances cannot afford your spending. That is what he said. Well, first of all, even if we did that, it might still not be true. Because if we did that, but at the same time, we added the 50 million that we have in the savings bank reserve and all of the other pots of money that we have that they left down to zero and which they, in financial years, which were election years, brought into the consolidated fund, we might even be left with a surplus even then. So I'm not going to accept that. If I calculated surpluses like they did, I wouldn't even have that, because I would have declared the extra 25 million I give to the companies as part of the surplus and the fund, the savings bank fund. Let's just look at those. I'd be up at 165 million of surplus if I did the things the way Sir Peter did them, to calculate the surplus. So I would not even be out of surplus then. But what if we did? Of course, my surpluses would be lower, unquestionably. If you take away from 80, 43, for example, the amount that Sir Peter spent in 1 year, you end up with another 40. Okay, fine. But what was the golden legacy of the GSD? What was it, Mr. Speaker? The £200 million in the cash reserve. Because of the surpluses, Mr. Speaker. That's what we were told was the golden legacy of the GSD. Mr. Clinton has just destroyed any credibility they might have in respect of that argument. Does he not realize what he says? I think he doesn't, because when he attacks, he doesn't realize that he's not just attacking me, he's attacking sometimes Gibraltar. He's affecting Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker. And he hasn't thought through that his arguments would not just attack me and attack Gibraltar. They destroy Sir Peter Caruana's claim, which they make for him, to have delivered consistent surpluses the last 4 years of administration, and indeed before. Let us look at how, by applying logic to his argument, he has just driven a coach and horses through the idea that the GSD had surpluses. Let me show him how bad his argument is. 2007-2008 was an election year. 2007-2008, the financial year, we were here in summer 2007 debating the budget. They declared a budget surplus of £15 million, £15.9 million. But they spent £23.5 million via the companies. Apply Roy Clinton's logic. Bang goes Sir Peter's surplus for the year. He ends up with a deficit of £8 million. And so, when Sir Peter said that he had a surplus of 15.9 million in the 2007 general election, that was an election lie by Clinton standards. That meant that that was a big lie election with a big budget lie by Clinton standards. A mirage, an optical illusion that they went to the people with. A deception, Mr. Speaker. Except now, by Clintonian logic, it is proven to have been a deception. In 2008-2009, the following financial year, with Mr. Feetham in government, bang, bang, aye, right? The surplus is allegedly 36.7 million. And in that year, they spent 48.2 via the companies. So by Mr. Clinton's clever argument, another GSD deficit that year of £12 million. A double-figure deficit now, if they calculate it according to how they want to calculate it. Another GSD mirage. One for which Mr. Feetham now bears responsibility because he voted for it. Not the 2007-8, the 2008-9. And in 2009-10, forgive me, Lord, I'm enjoying this too much. In 2009-10, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sorry that I am inflicting this intellectual humiliation on Roy Clinton, but he deserves it, Mr. Speaker, because he doesn't care when he comes at someone with a political knife, he doesn't care that he will cut potentially our people with it. So he deserves to have a self-inflicted wound made with his own logic. As his smugness turns to embarrassment in defeat, Mr. Speaker, he deserves the intellectual humiliation. In 2009-2010, the GSD declared surplus was 34.8 million. How much did they spend in the companies? 70 million. Mr. Speaker, that means that the GSD, by Clintonian economics, Clintonian accounting principles, Clintonian logic, carried that year a deficit of £35 million. It's flawed, it's incorrect, but it's the measure that he applies to us, Mr. Speaker. He has no credibility left even with his own people. They must all be thinking, my goodness, Roy, what have you done? Not only have you got us down the dead end of voting against budgets, which is the most unpopular thing we can imagine, you've now undone Sir Peter's golden legacy. Mr. Speaker, karma is catching the chameleons. And indeed, the worst possible argument, I think, is to create select committees to look into things, because that could really, really come back to bite them. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, 2011, the big idea that he's had to bring to this budget to deconstruct our record surplus is even more dangerous for them. They declare a surplus at 33.4 million. How much do they spend in the companies? 48.7. Another incredible 15.3 million deficit. And the following year, which is an election year, 2011, the election year, Mr. Speaker. The year in which, in that same debate, I was called unfit to govern, Mr. Speaker. That year, the surplus, £32.9 million. Motion against Fabian Picardo, unfit to govern. Daniel Feetham sitting next to the Chief Minister, here, aye, perfect. He could see himself, Sir Peter had said it was his last term, he could see himself sliding over as apprentice into this chair of responsibility, Mr. Speaker. And Sir Peter, with his feathers completely open as a peacock, declaring £32.9 million of surplus. His company spend? £63.9 million. Okay? Calculators at the ready? The GSD went into an election saying that they had a surplus of £32.9 million. The election year 2011, they told, by Mr. Clinton's standard, the biggest lie that this community has ever been told in a general election. They created a mirage, an optical illusion of surpluses when actually they were going into the election with a deficit. Mr. Speaker, with a deficit of £31 million by Mr. Clinton's standards. A hidden deficit, a deception on the electorate, persuaded to vote for them on the basis of a surplus, when actually, by Mr. Clinton's standards, there was a deficit. Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps that's why we only won by 400 votes. And yet, 4 years later, we won by 5,000 votes, Mr. Speaker. Because people were starting to see through them. Because by Mr. Clinton's standards, this was cheating of the worst sort. Of the worst sort. So I want to thank Mr. Clinton for the way that he presented his arguments, Mr. Speaker. Because by doing so in that way, the effect has been to completely annihilate, demolish, destruct the suggestion that the GSD was somehow better at creating prudent economic management and surpluses. But this is an accusation that is not therefore just leveled against me, Mr. Speaker. It's leveled by Roy Clinton against Sir Peter Caruana. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I suppose Sir Peter Caruana is left to sing them that other great culture club hit. Do you really want to hurt me? Do you really want to make me cry? The first line of that song, Mr. Speaker, the first line of that song is, "Give me time to realize my crimes." Do you really want to hurt me? Do you really want to make me cry? That's what these boy Georges have just done to Sir Peter Caruana. These political boy Georges, this political culture club that we have opposite, have just made the most heinous accusation against Sir Peter Caruana. More heinous even than any Sir Joe or I have ever made. They've said that everything he did was a big lie. That his surpluses were not surpluses at all. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, in fact, it is worth totting up the numbers I have given the House. Let's do the sums that I've just given you, Mr. Speaker. Calculators at the ready. In the financial year 7-8, the deficit in Clintonian economics is 8 million. In financial year 8-9, it's 12 million. In financial year 9-10, it's 35 million. In financial year 10-11, it's 15.3 million. In the financial year 11-12, the election year, the big lie, it's 31 million. Have you done the sums? The sum, Mr. Speaker, is a total accumulated deficit of the GSD in the financial years, just the last 4 financial years, 7-8 to 11-12, calculated according to Clintonian principles of £101 million of deficits. Golden legacy. It smells like the sort of thing that John should be taking a DNA sample from. Although we all know who did it, and we all know who to send the fine to. No need for DNA here. Thank you to Mr. Clinton for not thinking things through and for giving us the opportunity to do that analysis. Because in doing so, and to use his terminology as well, the GSLP liberal investigation has uncovered that their surpluses were a mirage, an optical illusion, a fraud on the electorate, that they perpetrated a big lie in the election of 2007, that they were unconstitutional in their use of funds. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It all tallies perfectly to the £100 million hole that we said that we found in the companies. Remember that? They said it wasn't true. But, Mr. Speaker, has he just proved it? Is he such a sleuth, Mr. Speaker, that actually he has found the hole that Mr. Feetham said did not exist, that Sir Peter denied ever existed? Has he just peeled back the emperor's clothes, Mr. Speaker? If his logic were right, that's what he would have done. Because his logic cuts both ways, you see. It doesn't just cut us. Because if you're going to calculate or uncalculate our surpluses in one particular way, you can expect that we're going to look at what it does to yours, no? And this is the problem, Mr. Speaker. When he wants to convene select committees, when he wants to vote against the budget, when he wants to do all of that, he doesn't think things through to the end. He thinks about his move, but he doesn't think through to the last move, Mr. Speaker. And in politics, and in protecting Gibraltar in particular, it is our responsibility on this side of the House, and it has always been the GSLP way of doing things, that we think through to the last move, not just to the next move. So, where is the financial fantasy now, Mr. Speaker? He said, I had a financial fantasy. Well, Mr. Speaker, I assure him, I have many fantasies, Mr. Speaker, but none of them are financial. I will leave those to him, Mr. Speaker, to come and go, like the chameleon, Mr. Speaker. But let's face it, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that is shot is his credibility. He should have gone to Specsavers, Mr. Speaker, before making his point, making his killer point on the budget. They're also running a 2-for-1 deal that he seems so enamored with. Mr. Speaker, he talks about the £300 million investment and that we hadn't disclosed that before the election. Well, Mr. Speaker, what had they disclosed of the roadshow which was going to lead to everybody's electricity bill being put up? Absolutely nothing. Well, and what had they disclosed, Mr. Speaker, of the resolution that they were going to bring to the House after the election to raise the borrowing limits because they had or were about to exceed the borrowing limits? So, Mr. Speaker, why is it that we are judged by one standard and they are judged by another? I endorse what Mr. Bossano says. I agree with Mr. Bossano. I give Mr. Bossano presents. I try to ingratiate myself to Mr. Bossano. Well, Mr. Speaker, then why doesn't he do what Joe Bossano is going to do, which is vote for the budget? Why doesn't he do that? If he endorses what Joe Bossano is saying, why doesn't he vote for the budget? The big difference, Mr. Speaker, the huge difference. The reason why Joe Bossano in opposition has not made these points and has supported the borrowing, Mr. Speaker, the big difference is that Joe Bossano doesn't want Gibraltar to fail and would never risk Gibraltar failing. He does not care. He only cares about himself. He only wants to see himself swept into power. He is ruthless in the way that he pursues his politics, and he does not care about our people, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, he says, I am an unworthy apprentice of Joe Bossano. I agree, Mr. Speaker. Nobody in this room as an elected member is a worthy apprentice of Joe Bossano. because he has given 47 years of his life to this chamber and more even to Gibraltar. He doesn't need to persuade me that I am unworthy to be an apprentice of Joe Bassano. I am lucky to have been an apprentice of Joe Bassano. And doesn't he know, Mr. Speaker, that the party that praises and usualizes Joe Bassano is the GSLP? And that the GSD is the party that sought to assassinate the character of Joe Bassano. And then, Mr. Speaker, what he says is, look, I'm sorry if I upset someone in the way I ask questions. Look, nobody upsets anyone asking questions, Mr. Speaker. You upset people, Mr. Speaker, when you impugn their integrity. Or is it that he's forgotten that in his letter to the principal auditor on the issue of community care, he said that there should be a kids club style investigation into things? Kids club doesn't mean the nursery, Mr. Speaker. No, I won't. No, Mr. Speaker, no, I won't. No. A kids club investigation, Mr. Speaker, a kids club investigation is an investigation into trustees who are alleged to have mismanaged funds. Kids Club in the United Kingdom was a trust that was intervened because of mismanagement of funds. He's not asking questions, Mr. Speaker. The minute you say that, what you're doing is impugning integrity, Mr. Speaker, whether he likes it or not. That's his style, to create innuendo and to impugn integrity. And then he says, I'm just asking questions. He throws the stone and then he hides his hand. But he's not even good at that, and we can see him, Mr. Speaker. And we will not let him get away with it. Mr. Speaker, he said he was pleased to hear that Barclays were ready to renew the loan, but then he was perturbed that I said that we might look at the savings bank to underwrite that loan for a period. Why is he always perturbed when we do things with the savings bank, which means profit for the savings bank, but he's not perturbed when we do it with Barclays? After Barclays left Gibraltar, high and dry, Mr. Speaker, despite the loyalty of the people of Gibraltar for 100 years, should we be giving Barclays interest in preference to giving interest to the Gibraltar Savings Bank? Well, look, Mr. Speaker, if he understands Joe Bassano and he praises Joe Bassano, this is one of the things that Joe Bassano thinks makes sense. Speaker, he asked me whether there was more securitization or borrowing, and I said no, there isn't. I should have given him a straight answer. He said, I did, Mr. Speaker. But none of these things which I'm doing, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the new mechanism to be able to guarantee 50-50 affordable homes for our people going forward, he said, have I done with the House. I've done it all before coming to the House, and the House doesn't get to find out about it. Didn't he hear me say, Mr. Speaker, was he too busy with his grubby little pencil, writing his grubby little speech in which he was going to ruin the GSD's legacy? Didn't he hear me say, I have to bring a bill to the House? A bill. I need an act of Parliament in order to do this. So not only is it going to be in the House, it's going to be in the House as a bill for debate separately. What is the price of the option of Victoria Keys, he said. Because I'd be very interested to know what the price of the option that the developers at Victoria Keys have. Because it would be very unfair if they paid nothing for it. The price of the option, Mr. Speaker, is 20% of their company. Mr. Speaker, isn't that remarkable? Isn't that remarkable? Mr. Speaker, he was complaining when I told him we were going to do the reclamation ourselves. He said, oh, you said you were going to do a reclamation? I was excited. I thought it was going to be people investing. Now you're going to do it yourself. Then when I tell him it's going to be done by third parties, he said, oh, I'm disappointed. I thought that it was going to be done by you. I'm no longer confused as to, I'm totally confused rather, as to who he wants to see the reclamation done by. Because he's confused himself, I think. It's utterly ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. Well, then he tells us, Mr. Speaker, that of all the jobs we've created, only 98 have been for Gibraltarians. Isn't that terrible? But except Laurel, or Hardy, I forget which is which, then tells us we created 8,000 jobs when we were in government, and you couldn't criticize us for not creating more for Gibraltarians because there aren't enough. And therefore I recognize that if you've only got 33 Gibraltarians unemployed, if you've only created 98 out of 1,000 for Gibraltarians, that's not bad. He just doesn't think things through.
Mr. Speaker, I really think that after the way that Gilbert Likudi deconstructed his arguments 2 years ago, the way that Albert Isola deconstructed his argument on the token amount this year, and what I've demonstrated he has done to the GSD's legacy, Mr. Speaker, he has no credibility left with anyone. Mr. Speaker, anybody who ever sees the slightest hint that they may be falling themselves into the trap of believing that Mr. Clinton is competent should watch Mr. Likudi 2 years ago, Mr. Isola last year, and if I may say so, with a little bit of self-deprecating humility, they should watch what I've just done to his argument on the surplus. They really should, Mr. Speaker, because no possible chance has he got of ever having a business as an expert witness in accountancy in courts, Mr. Speaker. Because once they see the way that his evidence is deconstructed here, Mr. Speaker, nobody will ever pay him to pretend to be an expert in anything, Mr. Speaker. But anyway, look, these are political, I suppose you would say, hatchet jobs, no, Mr. Speaker? But he gets up to try and do a hatchet job, Mr. Speaker. He gets up to do a hatchet job, to hurt you as much as he can, to damage your reputation as a person, to go underneath, to try and hurt you and to shred your humanity, Mr. Speaker, not caring about the damage he does to you or to your family. And then when it backfires, he'll complain that all we did was try and do a hatchet job when he cut himself up on his own blades, when the wounds, Mr. Speaker, are inflicted by his own warped logic and his failure to think things through, Mr. Speaker. That, I suppose, is karma. It catches out the ruthless chameleon every time. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, given that they express such concerns about the growth of recurrent expenditure, and I recall recurrent expenditure has gone up an average of 7% in our time in office. In their time in office, it went up an average of 17% a year. But every time they say that they are now concerned about 10% less growth in recurrent expenditure, maybe they'd like to ask me one day, who is the senior lawyer out there in Gibraltar who wanted to be DPP, but we couldn't agree the salary because he wanted it to be so high, so high, so high? Who's the senior lawyer who perhaps wouldn't be in politics today if I had agreed to pay him the amount he wanted, which would have pushed the recurrent expenditure up even higher, unacceptably higher, because we couldn't agree that amount? Who is that senior lawyer in Gibraltar today who wanted such a high salary? More than just 6 figures. 3 times more than just 6 figures, Mr. Speaker, in order to be persuaded not to go into politics. He didn't much care about recurrent expenditure then, no? So I expect not to hear much more about the increase in recurrent expenditure, Mr. Speaker. But he can ask me if he likes later. I'll tell him behind the Speaker's chair. Perhaps when I do, he might decide he has to share it with everyone, Mr. Speaker, which is his attitude to information he gets behind the Speaker's chair. He says, Mr. Speaker, that I'm making rich developers richer. But doesn't he realize that this is the first time that developers are being forced to share in the spoils of their projects? The first time that it's ever happened. The fat cats got fatter under them. He may or may not have banked their money for them. I don't know what he did, Mr. Speaker, as a banker. With us, they have to share. The few have to share with the many. They have to share 1/5 of their company, Mr. Speaker, because Joe Bossano thought that we should pursue that, and we did, and we achieved it. With them, the fat cats bloated, Mr. Speaker. With us, they have to share with the rest of the taxpayers. The few have to share with the many under us. With them, it's for the few, not the many. That's why we took back 1/3 of the plot that they gave to developers by direct allocation on the Midtown. That's what we did, not them. We took back 1/3 of the plot. So how can you tell us that we're making developers richer? They did that, we are not. And Mr. Speaker, when he and Mr. Hammond say all of these people, all these developers, and they name them and they say that they're related, I mean, one of them is related. I mean, I think they're very proud to be brothers. I don't think they're embarrassed at all. Does he know why we had to deal with them? Does he know? because I've said it before, but I'm going to remind him because I think he knows, but he tries to pretend he doesn't to try and persuade people in some way. I have to deal with all of them because they gave them a direct allocation of land at Coaling Island, and we've got it confirmed by somebody who was at the meeting when it happened. They made me have to sit down with them. So I haven't given to Isola, to Baldo, to Levi, to Butler. I haven't given. I found them there. They gave to them, Mr. Speaker. They gave to developers. Look, Mr. Speaker, developers are trying to do their business, which is development. With the land, they gave them by direct allocation. So it's not possible for them, if they're being honest, which they are not, to genuinely say, Picaldo gave to Baldo, to Levi, to Isola, etc. It's not true. I found them in ownership of the plot, Mr. Speaker. And I've already done how much they paid for the plot under them and how much more we've made them pay. But, Mr. Speaker, these are the same people to whom they gave, or at least one of them is the same person to whom they gave, and I make no criticism of this person. I'm making the criticism of them. They gave, one of these people, a contract for 1% of £1 billion for property development. They gave them that. Talk about fat cats, Mr. Speaker. Although I hope the man's very healthy, Mr. Speaker. Have they worked out how much 1% of 1 billion is, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the government is taking advice on whether we can publish that agreement and whether or not we should convene a select committee to investigate the circumstances of the grant of that contract in breach of EU procurement rules by the GSD administration at the time, which it was, and which I believe they knew it was. But if they look at the prices per square meter that we have achieved, which I did the exercise on, why aren't they congratulating us? We've achieved a great price, Mr. Speaker, for the land that we get in Coaling Island and that we sell. Isn't Mr. Hammond ashamed of the defamatory nonsense that he's spewed about this? Isn't Mr. Clinton worried that his reputation ends up worse than in tatters? In fact, Mr. Speaker, it's not in tatters, it's paper maché. Wet paper maché. It's not strong enough to put through a shredder, Mr. Speaker, once you do an analysis of the things that he's said. For once, we managed to get the developers to share with the taxpayers, and they criticize us. Why is it that they think that the taxpayer shouldn't share in the spoil of the developers? And why is it wrong for why is it right for somebody else to lend to the developers but not us? Why is it right, I suppose he says that as a banker, Mr. Speaker. As a banker, he wants the banks to make interest, not us for the taxpayer. Because lending money is a business. I would have thought I don't have to explain that to a banker, Mr. Speaker. As long as what he was is a banker, Mr. Speaker, not something else with one letter difference. Mr. Speaker, you see, what is wrong with us making money for the taxpayer from a development? What is wrong that was right? What was wrong that was right about supporting the project at the island at Queensway Quay? What was wrong with that, Mr. Speaker? That was right. Supporting the island was right, and supporting Taylor Woodrow having to do projects in a particular way, all of that was right. But us forcing developers to share with the taxpayers is wrong. Perhaps we should look in detail as to how permissions were obtained for those projects in that area, the island, and how Taylor Woodrow, Mr. Speaker, made decisions about its departure from Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps we should look in a select committee at all of that in great detail to see whether the public purse has been damaged, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the same senior lawyer might be called to tell us what he thinks about all of that. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker. But what's clearly true, Mr. Speaker, is that Mr. Clinton, he's not match fit, Mr. Speaker.
He's retired. He just goes around having coffee every day, reads the odd sets of accounts, makes a mistake here and there. He's not match fit, Mr. Speaker. He's not as sharp as he was if he ever was sharp, Mr. Speaker. And it's starting to show, because when you deconstruct the arguments, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing left. Let me just look at some of the things he said about borrowing, Mr. Speaker. The process for borrowing is set out under the 2008 Finance Borrowing Powers Act and its predecessor in 88. It has a section which is still the same, which is section 12. And it says this: every agreement specified in section 11, which is a loan entered into by the government, and this is about whether we should bring loans here before or after they're done. Every agreement specified in section 11 shall be laid on the table of Parliament at the next meeting of Parliament, commencing, this is the key word, Mr. Speaker, after the date on which the agreement is made. Why are things done after the agreement is made? Mr. Speaker, it's very obvious to me. The government is the executive. We have to negotiate those deals. And we come to Parliament to report. Barclays, or the Savings Bank, cannot negotiate with the Parliament. That's why things are done after. But he says, all of these things that you're doing, Chief Minister, they're not just not going through the book, we find out after they are done. Well, Mr. Speaker, if it was being done through the book, they would find out after they are done as well. Or is it that he doesn't understand that? Indeed, he also tells us that we should only announce things once the ink is dry on the paper. But then he wants us to announce them when he wants, before they're even done, Mr. Speaker. I tell you what he wants, Mr. Speaker. I tell you what he wants, what he really, really wants. This is what he wants, Mr. Speaker. This is what he wants. And nobody opposite should think that he wants the portfolio of a Minister for Public Finance. No, Mr. Speaker. He demonstrated it when, having said that the Chief Minister and the Minister for Public Finance should have been someone different, he then went for the leadership of the party. Just like the other young apprentice, this is what he wants. That is the reality of underlying everything that he does. Whenever he tries to sow a deception, he sows it in order to try and weasel his way into this chair. Because, Mr. Speaker, if it were true that he wanted to understand why we have not yet brought the borrowing, he wouldn't say we should have brought it before it is done, unless he can't read the word after and understand what it means. Because, Mr. Speaker, you cannot negotiate with a bank a refinancing of the historic 100 million or 200 million debt with the whole Parliament, or with a webcam on your face so that the honourable gentleman can see what's happening on a blow-by-blow basis. Mr. Speaker, it's a negotiation with a lending institution. It's not Love Island. It's not Big Brother. That's why these things come here after they are done, Mr. Speaker. And if we had to bring things here before they are done, Mr. Speaker, do you think we would be comfortable doing so? When the only thing that the Honourable Mr. Clinton does is go around the world, not just here, around the world, and say Gibraltar's circumstances in terms of budgetary process and public accounts committee are not fit for purpose. Gibraltar's lending is too high. The economy is on life support. The public finances are not sustainable. How can we negotiate the refinancing of our lending with somebody saying that, Mr. Speaker? Look, bankers work out whether the person they're going to lend to, good bankers at least, can repay the amounts that they're lending. If you've got a guy sitting next to the guy trying to take the loan saying, you haven't got the money to pay for that, you haven't got the money to pay for that, you're in deficit, you're not in surplus, you haven't got the money to pay for that, you are not accounting properly, you haven't got the money to pay for that, how on earth are we ever going to refinance a loan? So it's a good thing that we do things after, Mr. Speaker, but it's never stopped him, Mr. Speaker, trying to undo our ability to properly manage the finances of this community, Mr. Speaker. But he gave me one piece of advice. He said, don't make announcements about things until the ink is dry on the paper, he said to me. An advice I said I was willing to take. I would give him a piece of advice. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't raise innuendos about people's lives, about people's reputations, until you've asked the questions and understood them. Because we know his instant reaction is to jump to conclusions, always assuming that the worst is true, just like he did the other day, Mr. Speaker, with a negative report that he enticed GBC to do on me, Mr. Speaker. A simple question might have allowed him to properly understand in a perhaps more conciliatory way what he wanted to know. He might have been a bit less defamatory in the approach that he had taken, a bit more objective, Mr. Speaker. And then what he said the following Friday, which was just, no, I'm just asking questions. I'm just asking questions, would have been what he said on the Monday, where what he did was to make serious defamatory accusations. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that most bankers are not like him. And look, if he says that we have taken loans, if he says that we have increased the borrowing, well then, Mr. Speaker, again, by an extension of his own logic, if he is a banker and he respects bankers, and not many people do, Mr. Speaker, and I do, I just don't respect him as a banker, well then, Mr. Speaker, the bankers who have lent us the money that he says we have borrowed, which we say we have not borrowed, those bankers, who are from some of the greatest lending institutions in the world, Mr. Speaker, have done an x-ray and an assessment of us, and they have decided, having read what he has to say about our ability to repay, that they should lend to us if what it is lending, Mr. Speaker, by his standards, because we will be able to repay. So his kin and folk, his banking class, have done the proper, objective, non-partisan, non-political assessment and decided that we're a very good covenant for the money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what he said about the £100 million that I said to the GTA and what it would do to the deficit is, of course, also absolutely wrong. What it would do to the surplus, making it a deficit, is, of course, absolutely wrong, Mr. Speaker. But as I've already demonstrated that it's wrong because of the exercise I did on what he was saying about Sir Peter, I no longer need to show that there is no alchemy here, because what we have is Clintonian nonsense economics. No one here is turning water into wine, although probably Mr. Yamas would believe Mr. Sir Peter could do it, but I couldn't do it. And nobody is turning dust into gold. There's no alchemy here, Mr. Speaker. But of course, it's absolutely true. If we'd done the schools through the INDF, then the amounts in the cash reserves would be lower. I mean, look, is that something he needed? I suppose he discovered that, Mr. Speaker, after an investigation. Well, Mr. Speaker, he should just now move on and tell us what he would do if he were to take over when there is a general election in respect of those projects. Make the tough announcements, Mr. Speaker, of telling the teachers that they're not only not going to have their pay rises if they get into office, because that will push up recurrent expenditure, that they also will not even have the schools. I mean, because we're having the argument whether it's schools as important as salaries or not, but he would have to say no to both, Mr. Speaker. He would have to say no to both. And then, Mr. Speaker, he says that our ratio of expenditure to revenue is 97%, 96%, 97%. Well, Mr. Speaker, look, does he want to know how many years the GSD exceeded 97% in their recurrent revenue to recurrent income ratios? Does he want to know the year in which the GSD got to a recurrent revenue to recurrent expenditure ratio of 98.8% or 97.9%? Does he want to know that, Mr. Speaker? Because there are many years in which it happened. Or would he rather know, Mr. Speaker, that the average is 96%? Mr. Speaker, again, that which is normal, that which is running surpluses, in other words, you spend less than you bring in, he somehow thinks is something that he has to remark upon negatively. What is it, Mr. Speaker, that he doesn't understand or doesn't want to analyze? Maybe it's because he's retired. He doesn't want to go through the £676 million of spending that's going through this book. Doesn't he want to praise, if not us, the people in the tax office for the increases which are becoming sustainable in the collections there? Of course, we have to be prudent in the way that we estimate, but doesn't he want to at least take the good? But frankly, Mr. Speaker, I am going to not wait with bated breath for him to congratulate us for having been able to ensure that recurrent expenditure did not rise by 17.8% each year as it did under them, but only 7%. I'm not going to expect that he's going to congratulate us for having been able to come so closely with an estimate in every one of the years that we have been doing this. I'm not going to expect him to congratulate us for being able to stay below the expenditure estimate in departmental expenditure. But perhaps he should say or realize that neither we nor the controlling officers in all of the departments of the civil service, none of us have a crystal ball. And yet, we've done a remarkably good job of getting the estimates right. And perhaps he should think about spending a little bit less time discrediting everyone involved in the budgetary process. Mr. Speaker, when he talks that we are not transparent, now dealing with another point in relation to the companies, he says this: last Saturday I undertook an online exercise and looked at the filing records of the 37 new companies. Of the 37 companies, only 12 have filed any financial information at Companies House. As to financial activities of the other 25, we have no information at all. That's what he said. The way that he does that, Mr. Speaker, is designed to inject concern. I mean, you can say that in many ways, but the script is written to make people worry and fear. It's designed to create lack of confidence in the public finances, Mr. Speaker. But look, of those 37 government companies, as he calls them, 12 of them are not directly the responsibility of the executive. They are, for example, the University of Gibraltar, the Gibraltar International Savings Bank. All of these have boards which do themselves. It's not even a government company anymore, but he has to count it as a government company to get to 37. Mr. Speaker, of the remaining 25, yes, I mean, sotto voce, the honourable gentleman has just said it's still incorporated. Well, yes, so are the 14,000 other companies on the register, Mr. Speaker. Of course it's still incorporated, Mr. Speaker. Goodness gracious. Mr. Speaker, but of the remaining 25 in the analysis that he said he did on a Saturday afternoon, Mr. Speaker, what a fun life he has, Mr. Speaker. Of the remaining 25, 3 are companies that just act as directors and secretaries. In other words, they have no real activity, and we already explained here why we incorporated those companies, so that you didn't have directors having to resign and be appointed. You've got 3 companies which are designed to act as directors and secretaries. No activity. 3 are dormant. 8, he doesn't say this, but 8 don't need to file accounts under law because they've just been incorporated and the filing deadline hasn't passed. So that leaves 11 of which are with the auditor. So the auditor's accounts are being finalized. And by the end of the year, all things being equal, they will be filed. I wish they'd been filed already, Mr. Speaker, because I know that he loves reading my company's audited accounts more than anything else. And I'm delighted for him to be able to have them. I don't want to deprive him of the audited accounts, except we're having to reconstruct all of the accounts, as he knows, because they didn't file any of them, a point which will be important in dealing with the issues raised by the Honourable Lady. And Mr. Speaker, then he talks about this issue of the insurance fund that we have incorporated. Talk about, Mr. Speaker, looking at something good. Talk about looking at something good and saying it's bad. Indeed, what I can't reconcile is if they say that what Joe Borsano says must be followed to the letter, the creation of rainy day funds, etc., how he can even for one moment pretend that this is not a good thing. So, Mr. Speaker, what we were doing there was taking a GSD activity. The GSD activity was paying a premium for insurance and doing our own analysis showing that we paid out, or rather the payments were less than the premiums, a little bit like the concept of a captive which we created for ourselves. We're paying this money into a fund, Mr. Speaker, and in that way, we've created what is called a segregated deposit, which in effect becomes a fund, a sinking fund, a rainy day fund, all of that, Mr. Speaker. 2.5 million has been paid in, and 1.3 million has been paid out. Well, Mr. Speaker, He didn't say that that was very good. He said, and this is terrible because you haven't. Well, we've saved that money, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we have to create a fund. It's in today's Gazette. And I'm very proud to do it, Mr. Speaker, because it shows another rainy day fund, Mr. Speaker. He's got to be. So, I knew he would have a bit of an event, Mr. Speaker, sometime during the course of my speech. Yeah. So, another rainy day fund created by the GSLP, Mr. Speaker, which is doing very well. Another good decision taken to self-insure in that way. So if he wants, he can tick another box, Mr. Speaker, when he gets tomorrow's Gazette. And congratulations are due again to the GSLP for its rainy day fund policy. But Mr. Speaker, it's clear that his fetish for company accounts is matched only by the perverse conclusions that he reaches when he reads them. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, that everyone in Gibraltar, everyone in Gibraltar who is in the GSLP, is doing the wrong thing except him and them. Everyone is crooked except him and them. Everyone's on the make except him and them. But maybe, Mr. Speaker, it's because he does nothing. He never does anything except cast aspersions unfairly and improperly. The man who does nothing is never going to make a mistake, of course, Mr. Speaker. But what makes you fit to run the affairs of men is not just competence, diligence, or financial or other skill, Mr. Speaker. I think the key component of leadership is empathy. If you're not able to empathize with the work that people do and see their value, if you don't empathize with the people who work with you, Mr. Speaker, if you don't empathize with the nature of people's sacrifice and understand what it means, if you can't empathize with the people against whom you are going to make an illicit accusation, then, Mr. Speaker, you cannot ever fairly hold yourself up as somebody who should lead others. And after last week, Mr. Speaker, and the earlier part of this week, it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that he fails all of those tests. He fails it against the trustees of community care. He fails it, Mr. Speaker, against the financial secretary. He doesn't care if he fails it against me, and I don't care if he fails it against me either. But he fails it against all of those, Mr. Speaker. Because for all his pretense of competence and of investigations, he is just really, Mr. Speaker, a sad hack who cannot put a jigsaw puzzle together. That's the reality. He gets the pieces the other way round. He reaches the wrong conclusions. He doesn't care that he's attacking me at a personal level. He doesn't care about the effect on my family. He's got nothing to lose, Mr. Speaker. He's got nothing to lose. But when the effect of his constant mistakes, of his misjudgments, and of his errors starts to affect confidence in public life in Gibraltar, confidence in politicians generally in Gibraltar, confidence in Gibraltar's economy, confidence in Gibraltar's public finances, indeed, confidence in community care, then, Mr. Speaker, the damage that his lack of ability, his lack of empathy, his failures, his misjudgments bring is too high a price, even for his party, but certainly for this community to have to pay just because he wants to be involved in politics as a retirement hobby. That's the reality. That is the reality. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, he has the consistency of running water. And we've mentioned the teachers, but Mr. Speaker, I think it's unfair to labour that point. What about the Gib Telecom and Aquagib pensioners? Mr. Speaker, no sooner had he turned up on the 1st of May, a holiday which I am delighted to confirm every year as a socialist leader, that he was tweeting away saying, why hasn't Bicaldo paid the pensioners of Gibraltar and Aquagib? What's going on here? Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a good thing. It's a good thing he's not in charge, Mr. Speaker. Because as I said before, you turn up with a whistle, Mr. Speaker, and you've got him reaching for the checkbook just when he said there was no money left. It's nonsense. Absolute opportunism. And it's that sort of opportunism when they say one thing and then they do another. They say, we would not make any concessions to Spain. The tax treaty is a concession to Spain. We would never, on this side of the House, with this man sitting here and this man sitting here and the other woman and men sitting on the side, never make a concession to Spain. Never, of any sort, in a tax treaty or of any other sort. Never. Not one grain of sand, not one drop of water, not one breath of our air, Mr. Speaker. But who is saying it? Who is saying it? In opposition, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Phillips, and Mr. Feetham. And what did Mr. Feetham say when we created the artificial reef? He came back from holiday to help me to deal with the situation, to go on radio to say, well, look, I would be prepared to raise the concrete blocks if necessary. That is what we are dealing with, Mr. Speaker. And what did they do when they were in government? If it was up to them, we would be showing our passports to a Spanish Guardia Civil on flights from Schengen to continue to have the right to walk along the soil of our sacred land. That's what they did when they were in government. In Imperium Veritas, Mr. Speaker. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that Mr. Clinton's personal ambition exceeds his ability, his rhetoric exceeds his work ethic, and his eye for detail sometimes loses focus. He sees things where there are none, he reaches conclusions without proper research, and all of that, Mr. Speaker, even if it has been handed to him on a plate in answers to questions in the House. Noel Gallagher, Mr. Speaker, Noel Gallagher, who I very much look forward to seeing at the magnificent Gibraltar concert, at National Week this year, famously described his brother once, Mr. Speaker, as a man with a fork in a world of soup, who he thought would find it difficult to overturn a table of drunkards. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is that man with a fork in the world of soup who will find it impossible to overturn a government as strong as this one. But I did think it was priceless to see his guilty conscience lead him to a point of order before I'd even said good morning, Mr. Speaker. I could almost feel the butterflies in his stomach, Mr. Speaker. But I regret to tell him, Mr. Speaker, that I now agree with his illustrious predecessor, not about a class, because I'm not going to taint a whole class, accountants, with the same brush. There are some magnificent accountants, Mr. Speaker. But some accountants, him in particular, is what Sir Peter used to say of accountants: people who know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Never a truer word uttered when applied to this specimen, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps that's why Sir Peter never had him in his lineups. Perhaps he knew he was a walking liability who would undo the surpluses, Mr. Speaker. There was no chance that this one was going to accept that there was a surplus if actually there was a deficit. Clintonian economics and the GSD economic miracles couldn't live side by side together. He likes to talk about the debt, Mr. Speaker. He likes to talk about the loans. But what about, and this is the key point, Mr. Speaker. This is the key point on which I will end with him. What about the services? And this is back to the empathy point, Mr. Speaker. The empathy he doesn't have. He doesn't have it with me, but he also doesn't have it with our people, Mr. Speaker. What about the services? What about the homes? They're all in the book. What about the nurses? What about the policemen? What about caring, Mr. Speaker? None of that comes into his speech. None of that. All he cares about is trying to do down our economics, trying to do down our public finances. But what's he going to do? He hasn't told us whether he would stop the schools or any of the rest of it. He hasn't told us whether he'd stop paying the nurses. Because to cut recurrent expenditure, you can only do it in one way. You cut salaries or you cut people. Full stop. Right? That's what they don't like when they said they were going to cut 50 million from the recurrent expenditure budget. All we asked was, where? All we asked was, where? What will they do? Mr. Speaker, the way that he presents his argument, he presents us with only half of it. He tells us what he doesn't like, but he doesn't tell us what he's going to do to stop it.
what he's going to do is to stop the increases in the current expenditure. Because you see, the whole argument is a mirage. A mirage that is sustained by a Clinton magic money tree. He's saying, you can't pay for it, but I'll pay for it, and I won't tell you how. Sounds like a secret economic plan. The secret economic plan is either to cut nurses, cut teachers, cut police officers, cut public servants, and cut services, or to continue as we are doing. But that's why he only presents half of the argument, because he knows that the other half of the argument is completely unpalatable to everyone, including the people in his party who will not let him stand for election if he says that he's going to cut teachers, he's going to cut nurses, he's going to cut salaries. That is the reality. What a joke, Mr. Speaker. What a joke. No plan, no idea, no empathy, just a big accounting idea. And then moving the goalposts, because finally, Mr. Speaker, this year he decided he was going to try and deconstruct our surplus by reference to the capital spending in the companies. Last year, he said he was going to deconstruct our surplus by referring to the fact that the rebates and tax had not been quite caught up. This year, he fails to congratulate us for being the most up-to-date government in repaying those rebates in the history of our nation. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, instead of cutting nurses, he might just cut the rebates. What level of intellectual dishonesty we have had to put up with, and, Mr. Speaker, I have kept the House in that detailed riposte because it is absolutely fundamental for the health of our nation, the economic health of our nation, that people should understand that this was nonsense and not deserving of any credibility. But vamos. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, it's not as if he was followed by Mr. Hammond by anybody with any credibility. This is a man, Mr. Speaker, this is a man who on social media supports an individual calling the Chief Minister of Gibraltar a Führer. A Führer. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are many things that you can say about people, but supporting them being compared to the biggest killer of innocent people of the 20th century, short perhaps of Pol Pot, is worse than disgraceful. And once you do that, you don't start the debate with any credibility. None whatsoever. And then he says, having said that, Mr. Speaker, having said that our solar projects are scandalously monopolized for one individual. No, they're not, Mr. Speaker. But the same febrile brain that thinks that it's fair to compare the Chief Minister of Gibraltar with a mass killer of innocent people believes that requiring those who are going to install solar panels to pass a test by Gib Telecom that the energy they're going to produce is not going to destabilize the grid is somehow a bad thing to do. That creates a monopoly for one person. And he launches an innuendo and an allegation. Look, Mr. Speaker, the scandal is in the allegation, not in the underlying proper reality. The scandal is in the febrile mind that thinks that this is the way to do it. But can you see, Mr. Speaker, that there is a pattern emerging? They're all doing it. They're all going for innuendo and allegation. It's 1995 all over again. Deception, mirage, innuendo, all over again. And Mr. Hammond is just another one of those. But just another one of those who does it all from the standpoint of being a defender of diesel. A defender of diesel. He told us that a playing field full of footballers at Lathbury Barracks is more dangerous to the Upper Rock Nature Reserve than 8 diesel engines spewing black smoke. That is the sort of logic that leads you to describe the Chief Minister of your nation in the 21st century as somebody who is a Führer. That is the sort of nonsense that we have to put up with, and that the people of Gibraltar need to know is what they are representing. And these are the people who are asking you to put them in government, Mr. Speaker. That is what we are dealing with. thinks it's wrong that we continue to subsidize the electricity price. He thinks it's wrong. He thinks we should be getting everyone to pay the electricity price, the full electricity price. Okay, it's of you. But then don't tell us that we have to support the cost of doing business staying down, because that's going to put the cost of business up. Don't tell us that we're not helping families, as Mr. Phillips did, because if we were to uncap the cost of electricity, we would be crippling families, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. If on top of that you put 5% on it every year for the next 20 years, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that they would ever be able to make the argument that they are doing anything other than crippling families, Mr. Speaker. The diesel, absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. I'm told by Al over here, Mr. Speaker, to challenge them to put that in their manifesto. Put in your manifesto that you're going to increase the price of electricity. Because if you don't, Mr. Speaker, we will put in ours that that is what you said during the course of this debate that you were going to do. How can anybody make the argument that 22 men or women chasing a ball on a field are more dangerous to the environment than 8 diesel engines spewing diesel and smoke? Electrostatic precipitators or not? I mean, I think the Honourable Mr. Featon, when I told him about the dogs turning black, he realised how dangerous this was. And Mr. Speaker, he says they want more incentives for electric vehicles and that we should put up the tax for other vehicles. Okay, put that in your manifesto too. But say by how much you're going to put up the tax. By how much are you going to put up the tax on old cars which are not electric, Mr. Speaker? By how much? Silence. Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. Because when the time comes, Mr. Speaker, when the time comes, they bottle it. They bottle it every single time in their innuendos, in their allegations, in their aspersions, in their tax policy, in their everything, Mr. Speaker. They bottle it. They bottle it at every single level. And then he says, bunkering is a major polluter. Well, then put in your manifesto that you're going to stop the bunkering industry in Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker. Put that in your manifesto. Let's see what you are going to be able to do. Because you think recurrent expenditure is too high when we have revenue from those sources. What are you going to do when you get rid of it, Mr. Speaker? What plan is this? The plan is we're going to make less money, we're going to spend less money, but we're going to build more and we're going to pay more. Well, Mr. Speaker, that breaches Joe Bossano's golden rules, because you will end up borrowing to pay recurrent expenditure. Don't they get it? Do I have to do these exercises in logic for them? It is, Mr. Speaker, just incredible that they say to the people that they are a competent political party that could take over the reins of Gibraltar. They are not, and they are demonstrating it, Mr. Speaker. They say that we don't enforce the rules against GibDoc. We enforce the rules against GibDoc more than has ever been enforced before. The reason the negotiations are taking longer is because we're putting all those rules in their lease, Mr. Speaker. We want the economic diversification. We want GibDoc to do well, but we want them to do it well in an environmentally friendly way. That is our bottom line. It wasn't theirs. They gave GibDoc the lease, Mr. Speaker. They allowed them to create a reclamation of tailings of what came off the boats, Mr. Speaker. Or don't they remember, Mr. Speaker? We must commit to a better position on the environment. Well, Mr. Speaker, we must commit to a better opposition. There's the Honourable Lady's chance.
Yeah.
Now. She's going to make me tell her that her rocket chair is running out of fuel even before I intended to. But I will come to that. Mr. Speaker, maybe it's electric. Mr. Speaker. Then he says that what we're trying to do is make money for developers. Look, I've already told him it's not true in the answers I've given to everybody else. But didn't he hear me tell him in my main speech that what we had done was force the developers to come back to the table? We had to, I'm going to say it here, Mr. Speaker, explicitly, we had to threaten the developers. We had to say to them, we will reclaim in front of you, we'll have no access to the sea, because the direct allocation you were given was given without riparian rights. You know what those are? No, you don't. Well, look it up. Without riparian rights, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, we force you to the table, just like we forced them to the table on Midtown, and we said, you either give us back 1/3 of this plot, or you're not doing any of it. We are the ones who forced them back to the table. We fought for the taxpayer, for the little guy, against the developers. Doesn't he get it, Mr. Speaker? Doesn't he get it?
Well, at least, Mr. Speaker, what he did by throwing his wild aspersions was that he forced them to bring a bit more precision to their attack. And I thank Mr. Feetham for having got up and made the statements he did at the time. And now the only closeness that we have, the only proximity that we have, that they are concerned about with the developers of the Victoria Keys site is the fact that Albert Isola and Lawrence Isola are brothers. Wow. You never told me that. Well, maybe you told Sir Peter at the time of the direct allocation. Utterly ridiculous. Talk about falling apart at the seams. This is not the wheels falling off, Mr. Speaker, as Mr. Phillips said about my industrial relations policy. This is falling apart at the seams, Mr. Speaker. The guts, the tripe, is coming out of the animal, Mr. Speaker. This is really quite remarkable. Really quite remarkable. Well, he says it's terrible that when we make an inquiry about Victoria Keys, you blame the GSD. No, we don't blame the GSD. We explained that the GSD are the ones who had given the direct allocation to these developers. That's not blaming them. That's not blaming them. In fact, I did the analysis with the Speaker. I said they had another site, they traded it for this site, the price they got was too low, we got a better price. That's not blaming them, Mr. Speaker. That's explaining, Mr. Speaker. And then when all that was left for me to hear, he had a go at cement. He said, oh, cement is terrible. It creates dust. It's absolutely terrible, cement. Well, Mr. Speaker, cement creates dust. Cement also creates schools, hospitals, homes, primary care centres. All of them are built with cement. All of them are built with cement. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid until we find something else, we're stuck with cement. And yes, the sewage treatment plant has been stuck, but it hasn't been stuck for 7 years. There's been a lot of progress in 7 years. It's been stuck for 21 years, Mr. Speaker. 21 years without progress. But does he know why, Mr. Speaker? And does he know why we are making sure that if we sign on the dotted line, it's for a good reason? It's because of the salt water in our effluent, Mr. Speaker. And we need to be 100% contractually satisfied that we will be able to deal with the sewage. Otherwise, rightly, he would say to us, you've signed a contract that doesn't work. You should have been a little bit more circumspect and a little bit more diligent. But when you're circumspect and diligent, they say you haven't signed the contract. Typical middle-class hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker. Oh, how I hate it, Mr. Speaker. Honestly, because it demonstrates that people have nothing to give but criticism. Nothing constructive, no hard work, just criticism, innuendo, allegation, and aspersion, Mr. Speaker. And then he says, and you allow the Spanish fishermen to fish. I know that there are some in their executive who are obsessed with this, Mr. Speaker. Not as obsessed as we are. We think the law should be enforced equally across the board with no regard for nationality, not just on fishing, on cycling, on driving, on fraud, on every aspect, because that goes to the rule of law. Who made that point first? Joshua Gabai in this house in a magnificent deconstruction of the fishing agreement that the GSD had done, which said black upon white, the Spanish fishermen do not have to follow the law in Gibraltar, although Gibraltarian fishermen do. What did we do? We tore it up. What did they do? They criticized us for it. One of the main planks of their attack against us in the period 11 to 15 was Daniel Feetham saying John Galtes had been irresponsible for tearing up the fishing agreement. My goodness, anybody who is watching the morality play has worked out what they are. You're not enforcing it, he says. But look, Mr. Speaker, no handcuffs. I'm not a police officer. It's not what I do. I don't enforce laws, Mr. Speaker. I make laws. And I respect that there are others who are constitutionally independent, who I would not call, as Mr. Feetham said he would. Mr. Feetham said, I would call the Commissioner of Police and I would tell him, well, Mr. Speaker, I give my word to the people of Gibraltar that I take the call of the Commissioner of Police whenever he needs to inform me of anything because he believes it's in the public interest of Gibraltar that I should know. But I give my word to the people of Gibraltar that I have never and I will never pick up the phone to tell a Commissioner of Police what to do. Ever. They can have that confidence with us. They can have that confidence with us. And they have equal confidence with them that they would, because they've said that they would, Mr. Speaker. Don't they think it through? 2 for the price of 1. 2 for the price of 1. Mr. Speaker, we've got 6 for the price of 1. 6 for the price of 1. Look at the waste of money that the people of Gibraltar are investing in an opposition to hold the government to account, which is unable to understand the logic of the points that they are bringing. And then he tells us, why aren't you doing the buyback on the buses? Well, look, haven't they just been told that we spent too much? And he's telling us to spend more on the buses. But look, we're looking for new buses. But does he realize how difficult it is to get Euro 6 buses that fit our roads, that are less environmentally polluting? Or is he telling us just to get new buses and not care to get the choices right? Mr. Speaker, his attempt to have a snide go at my hard-won reputation is not worth responding to. It's not worth responding to. Mr. Speaker, I have worked in this community since I was 21 years old as a lawyer, as hard as I could. I've worked as a politician as hard as I could. I've worked as chief minister as hard as I could, to the detriment sometimes of my family, which is something that anybody who goes into this job has to understand. Look, if you don't want that, don't do it. But, Mr. Speaker, my reputation is what other people outside decide it is. I am confident that they have no reason to think that I have ever unjustly enriched myself, unfairly used my position to try and seek an advantage, or in any other way failed the people of Gibraltar in the discharge of my duties as Chief Minister. He's not going to judge me. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, if he did, I wouldn't care. It is as water off a duck's back. Because what matters, Mr. Speaker, is that every night, when I reconcile myself with my spirit, I know that I have done the right thing by everyone who crosses my path, even in deconstructing them today, because it is absolutely right for my people that I should do so. Mr. Speaker, what more did he say which is worth replying to? You're only resurfacing in an election year, he said. Well, look, we resurfaced every year. The money's in the book, but as they don't look at the book, they don't see it. This year there's more resurfacing. Yes, the more projects are being completed, so the developers have to finish the resurfacing. There's an Island Games coming. They're going to be going on the cycles, so we have to resurface. Mr. Speaker, it is obvious. Why make an issue out of that? Is it that they want to make bad points? Do they actually realize that we are more competent than them and they want us to win by a country mile? Is that why they're making points this bad? Mr. Speaker, when he talks about sustainability and the sort of government that we have and what we're doing, doesn't he stop for a moment to realize that I haven't delivered a budget that can be described as a budget full of election goodies? I haven't. I'm surprised they're not criticizing me for it. Except I suppose, in a way they are. Because they're saying to me that we don't do enough. At the same time as they're saying, you're not being prudent enough. Well, look, Mr. Speaker, I'm not giving away. I'm not giving away. This is what is known as a balanced budget. So, when he's finished with his innuendos, he might like to go back one day in his heart of hearts, Mr. Speaker. He might want to go back and reread the speech that he gave and ask himself, Mr. Speaker, whether he did the right thing in trying to raise the innuendos that he raised. But, Mr. Speaker, he might also want to take me to one side and say, who was that senior lawyer in our community that you are saying, given that he wanted to talk about developers and abuse, who was that senior lawyer in our community that you were saying had something to do with the island and the way it was done, had something to do with the way that Taylor Woodrow decided that they wouldn't continue to do some of the work that they were doing in the way that they were doing it. You might want to ask me about all of that, Mr. Speaker, and I might be persuaded to tell him, Mr. Speaker. Where were the probity of tenders and interviews in the time that they were in government? How did relatives of my predecessor get jobs in Gibraltar's London office, Mr. Speaker, when those jobs weren't advertised and weren't interviewed for? Doesn't have to ask me. They're sitting in his executive. He can ask them directly. Might want to ask them about their flares and how they got confiscated as well. Mr. Speaker, what about the land on the existing coaling island granted to the party for nothing that had just sold for millions at Ocean Village? What about that? What about the conflicts that arise there? Doesn't he like to raise the spectre of innuendos and cast aspersions? Does he want to ask about that, Mr. Speaker? And who, Mr. Speaker, who was the lawyer who wanted a huge amount of money to BTPP, who obviously had no concerns about the recurrent expenditure levels of Gibraltar under the GSLP Liberals. Otherwise, he couldn't have justified asking for that money and leaving a paper trail of it too. Mr. Jamas is leaving us on a jet plane, I hope, to a lovely holiday before he returns to the civil service. So unfortunately, we know which wing of the GSD won, and I'm very sorry that his did not prevail. Slim Shady didn't stand up. He never stands up, Mr. Speaker. I know him. I know Slim, and he never, ever stands up. I tell him honestly, Mr. Speaker, and I tell him, because he's quite a collegiate politician, I tell him as a friend, Mr. Speaker, close to the floor of the House, that I very much look forward if the people of Gibraltar do me the honour of making me once again their Chief Minister. It is a precious honour, which I do not take for granted, but if they do me that precious honour, I look forward to welcoming him back to the civil service. He will be very welcome back to the civil service. He has tried to do an honest job in this House. I mean, a bit too much survey monkey for my liking, Mr. Speaker. I don't think he's hit the target every time, but he's tried to do an honest job in this House, and he deserves our respect for that. He has not approached us with bad milk, which is probably why he doesn't fit in with the rest of them, Mr. Speaker. But he was one of their best speakers in being honest, Mr. Speaker, in just setting out genuinely, honestly, that he cares and he wanted to contribute in his way. And that's why I tell him really honestly that I will welcome him back to the civil service. Look, he will allow me the quip that I hope that he thinks about voting for the budget, because otherwise he will come back to the civil service to receive an emolument which we will have voted for, but not him, which would be a sweet irony. But he should be allowed sweet ironies, Mr. Speaker. The skywalk, Mr. Speaker, the rise of the skywalk, Mr. Speaker, is, I think, a very good thing. And I think he more or less indicated that he was happy with the way that we had done some things, although he wished we had done more. Fair enough. On drugs, Mr. Speaker, that's in the report that I'm putting before the House, which one department I'm still waiting for, so I hope to be able to lay it before the third reading. It'll be a very full report. The Honourable Member will be able to look at it. On medicinal cannabis, Mr. Speaker, I do think that honourable members opposite no longer know what they think on medicinal cannabis. But fair enough. Look, it's a developing area. I think the honourable lady and we have led on that. But I think as we develop that area of policy, I think he will see that we're being very, very careful indeed in how we're going to try and approach that particular area of diversification. The best line in the whole 72 hours from members opposite: a little less conversation, a little more action. A great line from a great song by Elvis Presley. Mr. Jamas was inspired. I think he was inspired by the relief he feels as finally escaping the prison that is the GSD, free from the incarceration in the non-Caruana GSD that he found himself in. It must have been a bit like the jailhouse rock, Mr. Speaker. And I think he must have said to himself, "It's now or never." So I look forward to him putting on his blue suede shoes and sashaying over to the government, getting away from those people there with suspicious minds. We won't be cruel, Mr. Speaker, when he comes over to us. Even when he's gone, he will always be on our minds, even if he's off with his hound dog, Mr. Speaker. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye, a job well done, Mr. Speaker, even if I've disagreed with him a lot in the time that he has been there. I don't know whether he realized, Mr. Speaker, that the song that he was quoting actually is all about what I would ask of them, Mr. Speaker. All about that. A little less conversation. A little bit more action, please. All of this aggravation of the past 48 hours, all of this aggravation ain't satisfaction. A little more bite, a little less bark. A little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open your heart, and then satisfy me, babies. Well, a little bit more of that, a little bit more of what the honourable gentleman did, and a little bit less of the spite and the anger and all of the innuendos and vitriol that we got from honourable members opposite. A little bit more of that might have got them closer to being the sorts of representatives that the people of Gibraltar would wish to see discharging the functions of government in our nation. Mr. Speaker, he was very clear that he felt that the relevant revenue sources should be used to recover the cost of generating particular electricity in this case, etc. I think he has been explicit in that, and fair enough, it's a clear view. And he was particularly explicit on why he trusts Peter Caruana and he trusts the way that he was doing things. And I consider that to be absolutely fair and absolutely proper. You trust him and you don't trust me. Maybe now you trust both of us or whatever, but you trust him and that's what you believed in and that's why you thought that you should be in the GSD. That is fair enough. Obviously now he's sitting with people who think that the next canonization should be Joe Bossano, and for the real GSD, not much of it left, for the real GSD, that might stick in the craw. At least with them we know what we're dealing with. Anyway. He said we should not have clad the estates, we should have built new. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised at that. I'm surprised at that because Sir Peter Caruana, in his last manifesto, had the cladding of the estates. He had the cladding of the estates. And building a new estate would cost upwards of 250 million. So if we're told that we don't have money, well, Sir Peter would have put it through the companies and it would have been fine. But we're told to do all of that. Well, Mr. Speaker, there was so much contradiction in the 6 speeches, Mr. Speaker, that it is impossible to reconcile a policy. But I thank him, at least, for the honesty, Mr. Speaker. Cladding buildings has the benefit of giving them an extra lease of life. And there are a lot of buildings now clad that will be able to therefore have a good and valid life for a lot longer. And Mr. Speaker, also dealing with the development of estates, he needs to be reminded in his further considerations as to what he does in the future, that this party, whether under Sir Joe Bossano when he was Chief Minister or under the terrible Fabian Picardo now that he's here, has never lost a penny of taxpayers' money in loans to developers. So all of the allegations from all of them, including Mr. Hammond, about us enriching developers, you have to add an additional layer. That they lent money to a developer. They say, how dare you lend for Victoria Keys, fully secured, to make a decent percentage, I think it's 5%, and to get the land. But they lent to OEM. They lent £7 million to OEM of taxpayers' money. Unsecured. OEM went into liquidation. We lost the £7 million of taxpayers' money. So, Mr. Speaker, all I would ask is that in the way that he does things, which I think is quite fair, he should, once he's out of the political fray, do a reassessment of who does what and who's done it. And look, you might end up saying, I prefer Sir Peter's style, but I accept that he made mistakes, and I don't like the style of Joe and Fabian, but look, they never lost money. And I think he will be fair in the way that he deals with us once he has gone. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Mr. Reyes for his contribution, as usual. He started in the area where we can all, I think, support, which was the support for our national teams in their fight for international recognition, and he supported us in doing that, continuing the work that they had done and that the GSLP had done before them. I think an area where we can all entirely agree. He said that they were right about the Victoria Stadium. Well, they weren't, and I'll explain to him why, Mr. Speaker. In their plan, the Victoria Stadium stayed in public ownership. We spent money turning it into the GFA's stadium, because that's the way that they would have done it. In other words, taxpayers' money, which they say we don't have, would have gone into just one sport, getting a better facility. And that's the end of it. We've done a different model. We've sold to the GFA for 16.5 million. They invest their money in upgrading it, and we invest that money in the sporting facilities around Gibraltar. So I don't think that we have pursued their idea. I think our idea was better. But look, he puts his position as the one that he thinks was a valid one. He doesn't insult anyone in doing so. He does the politics that I think would be good politics for us to do, which is simply to say, look, you're saying this, I think this is better. Let's get people to decide which one they think is best. Look, politics of ideas. Thank you for doing the politics of ideas. Thank you for bringing into the House the success of Sebastian de Soysa. He really is somebody who we should recognize the talents of. I'm seeing him, I think, next week. I'm very much looking forward to seeing him. I see him when he was little. Now I'm seeing him when he's bigger, and his success continues to grow and grow and grow just as he does. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that he deserves the recognition of this House. He's wrong, Mr. Speaker, to think that we've abandoned our plans for the theatre, although they did not take priority over other areas of expenditure, in particular in these Brexit years. We'll soon be, I think, coming out with a proposal in respect of the theatre, which we are working on at a partisan level before we are able to elevate it to a government thing, which I hope will be very interesting and that people will look forward to seeing. And Mr. Speakers, look, I agree, teachers are not given to picketing. Teachers exercise their influence in our society in different ways. I don't think anybody has ever really said that I'm not a fan of teachers, even though I may not yet have been able to do a deal with them on salaries. I have said enough before there was ever any dispute between me and the teachers for me to have a very good record in that respect. And you're right, they're not given to picketing. I did the exercise of distilling those teachers who have gone into public life, himself included, to influence in a different way. But look, if you rabble-rouse, you can probably get anyone to picket. And if you have people who are related to people who are politically your opponents, etc., involved in that, you can do all of that. You can do all of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is a modern, open democracy. People are entitled and encouraged to do that because, when people picket, I welcome them, I remonstrate with them, I give them my opinions, whether they like it or not, and that's absolutely proper. But that is actually something which I consider a good thing, not a bad thing. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Feetham will forgive me for treating his speech as the speech, really, of the leader of the opposition. He's the only person who is clear, if sometimes incoherent, in his criticism of the government. He puts a lot of higgledy-piggledy. He's a little unjoined up, and he doesn't think through the consequences of what he's going to say. But I've always been grateful for that, because it's what allows me to demonstrate that he's wrong, but he does it, Mr. Speaker. And he does it, Mr. Speaker, in a way that was the style of the speech of a leader in waiting. A leader of the opposition in waiting, I hope, because I don't think he has the judgment to be Chief Minister. If I did, I would be supporting him. But he does it with the passion also, if not the judgment, of a leader in waiting. And Mr. Speaker, passion is what gives us each the fire and the work ethic to be a leader. And it's what I think creates a good minister, what creates a good chief minister. And I'm sorry that he and I sometimes don't agree on matters relating to judgment, because he certainly has everything else, but he has that fatal flaw. But my goodness, compared to anything else that we saw from the opposition benches, the official opposition benches, he was on fire yesterday, Mr. Speaker. He was much better. I know that this is the time of the year that he likes to cry, but he doesn't need to pretend, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't need to pretend. He really was on fire. I will tell him, Mr. Speaker, that he was, as far as I am concerned, a very, very worthy opponent at the last election. He was perhaps never prepared to work as hard as I was prepared to work, but there he was, always ready to fight, always ready to go for me as I was ready to go for him, to do that thing which he was talking about yesterday, which is the adversarial test that our system requires us to subject each other to. Mr. Speaker, he probably had and has a higher opinion of his ability than he should in order to safely engineer his passage through politics, which is also for us a very good thing. But, Mr. Speaker, I will tell him that I did think that he led the opposition yesterday and in the past 3 days. The official opposition was once again led by him. Titles matter not when it comes to demonstrating who is really leading the pack. And he's the one who always tells us about there being wolves in the GSD, so that's why I tell him he's leading the pack, Mr. Speaker. Although I will tell him that I'm not so jealous anymore, Mr. Speaker, of the six-pack. Not so jealous anymore. Almost there, Mr. Speaker, almost there. But let's look at the contradictions that he creates when he says that we are not fully transparent. And let's look at why he doesn't think through the statements that he makes. It's all a debt mountain, deferred taxation, or public sector cuts and austerity in the future. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that viewers of the Culebron, readers of the morality play, will know that that is the same speech that he delivered in 2014, and in 2015, and in 2016, and in 2017, and in 2018, and he has delivered it again this year. It's simply not true that the tax treaty is outrageously one-sided. It's simply not true, Mr. Speaker, and I will demonstrate why when it comes to the debate that we will have on that subject. We are not taking a risk with the public finances. And Mr. Speaker, why does he say that the people who find it difficult to make ends meet are the ones who suffer the most? Well, they're already earning, if you're talking about people in the minimum wage, 1/3 more under this government than they were under them. 1/3, of course, those who were earning the full minimum wage. But they had people on half the minimum wage, a very, very unsocialist position. It's the same contradiction that when he says that the a mí me pertenece culture is fueled by election auctions. Well, okay, but then how does he deal with his reaction to the claimants against government? Egypt Telecom and Aquajib, teachers, etc. How does he deal with the dismantling of his friend Mr. Gomez's work as the Central Arrears Unit by the GSD? We believed in that, Mr. Speaker, and we brought it back. But the seed of the a mí me pertenece culture is not to chase people who don't pay, because that is what catches. It's like runner beans. It goes everywhere, Mr. Speaker. And so he is identifying a symptom which they brought to the equation. And then he talks about the principles, the Joe Bossano principles. Those are the ones that I've been talking about. But when he was here, he was doing the opposite. He was supporting that Joe Bossano should retire. How many times in his political career has he said, the time has come for Joe Bossano to retire? Only to say to us that he doesn't want Joe Bossano to retire. Joe Bossano's giving health warnings. Yes, so was I. Does he only selectively hear? I suppose, look, it's politics, so I won't blame him for that. He's extracting the bit he wants to make his argument. But does he think, in doing all the things he's done in this attempt to create political proximity in his arguments between him and Joe Bossano, does he think that Joe Bossano prefers them to us? Does he think that Joe Bossano believes the GSD should form government, not the GSLP? Does he think, Mr. Speaker, that he is strong enough in the force to lure Joe Bossano over to the dark side? No, Mr. Speaker. You are not a Jedi yet, Mr. Speaker. We don't have electoral auctions, and we're not going to have an electoral auction, Mr. Speaker. But you see, when Joe Bossano issues a health warning on the Gibraltar economy, he wants it to be wrong. They want it to be right. That's the key difference. Joe Bossano says, look, things could go wrong and we have to be careful, and he hopes that they don't go wrong. They hope they go wrong, so that sweeps them into power. That's the reality. That's the reality. And, Mr. Speaker, on his lips, it sits very, very uncomfortably to say that we're debating half of the accounts of the government when we're debating exactly the same accounts of the government that we were debating when he was here. How can he say that this is a systematic re-engineering of the finances of the government when he sat here and did this? When they were presented in exactly the same way, for the reasons I have demonstrated to him when I did the double act analysis of him and the other boy in Culture Club together, and how they supported Sir Peter. So, honestly, I really think that it's impossible for him to sustain the position. And when he does the analysis of the debt per capita, if he wanted to be fair, and I assume that once the cameras stop rolling, he will want to be fair, he will know that the analysis I did in 2011, I said, although I don't think this is the right analysis to do of the economy, in 1995, this is what Freddy Vasquez did, and I think it's fair to now do it to you for that reason, although it's the wrong analysis of the economy. But look, if he's not interested in acknowledging that, no problem. When we are in our 70s and we're downstairs having coffee saying that things were much better done in our time than they are then, he can at least say, no, I realize that's what you said, but obviously I wasn't going to admit it at the time. I shall look forward to the coffee. Mr. Speaker, if we had a veritable curtain, they have built the Berlin Wall. Well, Mr. Speaker, we built the Berlin Wall and we put something in it called the Brandenburg Gate, which is the government website, where we put all of the information so that people can have it, including a presentation, etc., etc. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that there's good grounds for them to say that we are in any way less transparent than they were, but I do recognize that they just want to say it in order to go back to the arguments of 1995, which led to the defeat with all of the innuendos and all of the allegations against the then GSLP government, with all of the people who were then hurt and damaged as a result, let alone defeated. The difference between, Mr. Speaker, our spending on commonplace and theirs is very simple. They spent on luxuries, we spent on floor space, which adds to the value which the taxpayer has. It's that simple, really. They say that in 2011 we failed to tell people that we would change the Savings Bank Act. Mr. Speaker, the whole debate in 2011 was Sir Peter saying, look, if you want to get rid of debt, all you need to do is con un plumazo, you do it in this way, and you move it all in or out of the savings bank. It's simple. But look, does he at least recognize that they, in the 2011 general election, did not say that after the election we had to come to this House with a resolution to increase the borrowing limit? I think he didn't know, Mr. Speaker. I think he didn't know. So, on his young apprentice's responsibility, I will not try and put that, because I don't think he didn't know that or much anything else, although he likes to pretend that he was very close to Sir Peter. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, the issue of the funding through the government companies I've dealt with, but the one issue I do have to deal with in detail with him is this question of Bermuda, Mr. Speaker. I have to deal with that now. They are saying that Bermuda changed the borrowing limits and therefore Bermuda got itself into trouble and went bankrupt, and that's what we've done here, and therefore we have to be careful. This is the, well, he hasn't gone that far, he says, but that's the innuendo that he's trying to create in order to create that fear. So let me just deal with this, Mr. Speaker, because of course what they were going to do was exceed the borrowing limit. They were not going to change the borrowing limit, at least not initially. They had done that before. What they were going to do after 2011 immediately, they might have changed the borrowing limit again, was bring a resolution to the House to exceed the borrowing limit. In other words, they were going to go beyond the borrowing limit. They were going to do a Bermuda. They were going to go beyond the borrowing limit. Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. Let's be very clear what's happening here, and I need to demonstrate why he doesn't understand it. Because he dedicated a part of his combative speech yesterday saying we had not been honest. I'm being remarkably kind, gentle, and fair to him, given that he said we had not been honest, Mr. Speaker. But I'm going to prefer to just show him how wrong he is, rather than for some entertainment, go for him in another way. You see, he says that we went to the election in 2015 where one of the subjects was public debt, and we didn't say that we were going to change the way that our act was set out. He says that we said nothing in our manifesto about the debt ceiling, and then when we were elected, we did this. Obviously, well, we did it not privately, we did it here with the cameras rolling, etc., etc. And then he says Bermuda did this and all of the rest of it. So let's look at what happened, Mr. Speaker. Didn't his colleague, who he lavished praise on yesterday as well, say this? Mr. Speaker, the official gross direct debt of the government of Gibraltar is £447 million, which is made up of £247 million of debentures held by the savings bank with no fixed maturity and £200 million of debt borrowing. He said it, I think I said it too, because it's the position. This was the gross public debt also, Mr. Speaker, in 2015, before the election. It hasn't changed. You see, we changed the debt ceiling, but we haven't in any way changed the debt. And Mr. Speaker, in fact, with the sinking fund, it goes down to 435. Bang goes the Bermuda warning. Bang goes the Bermuda warning, Mr. Speaker. It's as if the Bermuda Triangle had manifested itself here, because he's saying we're doing this to go up in debt, and we're not going up in debt. It's remarkable, Mr. Speaker. It's remarkable, Mr. Speaker. So, in fact, Mr. Clinton then gets the sinking fund wrong and gives us more credit for the sinking fund for the year just ended than we should have, because he's worked it out on the basis of the year to come. But anyway, the Bermuda problem is not coming, Mr. Speaker. Because you see, although Bermuda may have had those problems, and although the Bermuda issue may have arisen with the rising of the debt ceiling in law, we haven't raised the debt. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality. So when he raises this issue, what he does, Mr. Speaker, is he sets himself up to shoot his colleague across the way. It's almost a bit like seeing that instance when Dick Cheney was going out quail hunting, Mr. Speaker, and ended up shooting a Texas police officer because he really does incur unfriendly fire. Debt is where it was, Mr. Speaker. We've done the capital projects in the same way as Peter Caruana did them. So, frankly, I don't think there is absolutely any good reason for the passion that he deployed in suggesting that we had absolutely any problem whatsoever. He said, you have to be able to open the books of the government. They're totally open. They just don't bother to open it, Mr. Speaker. They're here, they're online, all the information is there in exactly the same way as Sir Peter used to craft it when he used to bang the table and support it. And he says, you have to be exemplary parents with demanding children. Don't just say yes to things. Well, there's no goodies in this budget. And as he knows, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that they say that the wheels are coming off my industrial relations policy is because I don't just say no. They criticize me for both things, for saying no and because they say I'm giving away too many things. They need to make up their minds, Mr. Speaker. With him, I expect it. He used to say that I was the greatest Machiavelli in the world, whilst at the same time saying that I was going to be Joe Bossano's puppet. Well, those contradictions are not new, Mr. Speaker. But anyway, then, Mr. Speaker, he has spent, Mr. Speaker, the past 4 years saying that Joe Bossano is unsocialist, that he is working on the issue of the agency workers in the inappropriate way, that the future job strategy was a disaster, etc., etc. Something happened to him. Not to Joe Bossano, not to any of us. Something happened to him. I don't know when it happened, but something has happened to him. Because I'm the one who thought that, and who fought very, very hard. I believed, and like many others believe, that Joe Bossano was worthy of recognition. I fought for his knighthood. You're fighting now for his canonization. You're trying to make him a saint. You thought he should retire. You were part of the character assassination by joining the GSD, that this man had overstayed his welcome, voodoo economics, they used to say of him. And now he says that the man is as a saint, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, Joe Bossano has the satisfaction, Mr. Speaker, of going into his last 2 decades, I hope, as an elected politician, because I don't believe he'll leave in 10, knowing that he's persuaded everyone in the House that Brussels is a bad thing, when it was never like that the 4 golden rules on debt should be followed, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is really quite a remarkable achievement. But not just that, he hasn't just persuaded you on issues, on Brussels and on the golden rules on debt. He's persuaded you on socialism. In this place, people now come to outdo themselves as socialists. No, you're unsocialist because you've done that. No, you had a drink of champagne once. There was a bubble. No, it wasn't. It was Perrier. No, it wasn't champagne. You're not a socialist. A remarkable achievement, Mr. Speaker. A remarkable achievement. And perhaps it's because Mr. Feetham did exactly what he told Joe Bossano he would do when he came back from the United Kingdom. Me voy a cargar el GSD. I'm going to destroy the GSD. Chapeau, Mr. Speaker. I was wrong. He is the most Machiavellian guy in town. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, people are now paid the full minimum wage. They don't have to suffer the ignominy of being paid the unsocialist half minimum wage by him. The only difference, he says, Mr. Speaker, people used to go to the ETB asking for a job and they were sent to recruitment agencies. Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the only difference is that they went to the ETB instead of his office, because in 2011, people were asked to turn up to his office for a pre-election job. If they'd have caught another 100, Mr. Speaker, we might have had it. Anyway. But at least he had the human dignity to congratulate us in respect of the lowering of unemployment. We all agree that whilst there is one person unemployed, that's one person too many, but we're all happier, at least he and we are happier that the number is down to 33 from the higher numbers, and we'll see what the monthly, the quarterly average is, which is the figure that matters, Mr. Speaker. He defended the record of the GSD in creating 8,000 new jobs in 16 years. I suppose by doing so, he would think that we have double, 2 for the price of 1, the good record, because we've created 8,000 jobs in 8 years. So, good, I suppose, Mr. Speaker, and he might one day bring himself to say that we did a little better. So there's no question of us, nonetheless, having gone down to a mad scramble to produce revenue from government coffers by selling land to developers, by the way. Absolutely none of that. But I will tell him that the other saint that he likes to create, the greatest Gibraltarian of all time, according to him, said that the transformation of Gibraltar, and this is a direct quote from Sir Peter in 2006, who said, the transformation of Gibraltar since 1996 has been possible in great measure because of the government's economic success and also because of the government's sometimes criticized policy of selling development land and rights to private developers so that the proceeds can be invested for the benefit of the whole community. That's the government he sat with. That's what they did. So I don't suppose he's criticizing that. But then again, he might be. Although in 2008, with him here, he said this, Mr. Speaker. He went through all of those issues and he said, government are now moving quickly on several fronts to rectify this policy failure, which was the not enough building of affordable homes. However, this justifiable criticism should not be abused by some and misunderstood by others to justify criticism of the huge amount of private investment that there is in real estate projects in Gibraltar. Apart from reflecting huge international investor confidence in and support for Gibraltar, it represents massive present and future economic benefits for Gibraltar, a very significant increase in government revenues, in jobs and in investment in our commercial, urban and utility infrastructure. The economic benefit to Gibraltar of projects like the East Side, the Midtown Project and the Mid-Harbours Project is truly huge and will guarantee this community's economic and social prosperity and therefore its political prosperity for a long time to come. International investment is vital to our economy, to people's employment, to people's businesses, to government revenue and thus to public servants and users of the public services. In short, to each and every person in Gibraltar now and in the future. Sir Peter Caruana, with Daniel Feetham sitting next to him saying, aye, aye, hear, hear. Are they all listening? All the ones who said that it was terrible to give stuff to developers, not just him, Mr. Hammond, and all the rest of them. Because Sir Peter went on. It is therefore unforgivable to trivialize this investment by pitting it in people's minds against the environmental, social, or housing needs of the current local residents. The government will ensure at all times that these investments deliver the economic benefit to Gibraltar, whilst also ensuring that local needs and interests are protected. And what did he say then? Yeah, yeah. Remarkable, Mr. Speaker. Remarkable. Remarkable. But look, Mr. Speaker, he's a hero worshipper who has to deal with the things that Mr. Caruana said, that Sir Peter said. Look, he said them. You hero worship him. You have to support them. I think that the things Joe Bossano said were the right things, and I've always supported them, and I've criticized some of the things that Peter Caruana has said. But sometimes, when criticisms are leveled at us for doing the things that we didn't criticize them for, because it was actually, if you go on talking about people outside the house who were saying that, not us, then they have to recognize that they are now criticizing us for the things that they did. That's the reality. That's why we are different to them. We are consistent in opposition and in government. Even when I do the calculation of the debt per capita, I say, this is wrong, but you did it, so I want to do it, so people understand that by your measure, this is what is happening. And yet they are taking different positions. They took one position, Mr. Speaker, and then they took another. And then, Mr. Speaker, then he said, you have been too lenient on senior members of the Financial Services Commission in the past. Darth Vader was back in the room, Mr. Speaker. The fear factor returned, Mr. Speaker. I thought he didn't need to do that, Mr. Speaker, and it was unnecessary, especially given the comments he made later. But, Mr. Speaker, it's very, very clear to me, that he doesn't understand what Joe Bossano is saying if he thinks that Joe Bossano agrees with him. He should have worked out that Joe Bossano was not here for a reason, Mr. Speaker. He couldn't bear to waste time to hear any of them. He doesn't think it's a worthwhile use of his time. It's better spent trying to drum up business and work for Gibraltar than to come here to listen to them now say that they agree with him when they went to an election to say that he should be kicked out. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, he said that popularity can be lost easily. I fully agree. I approach the next election, as I do every day, knowing that I have to earn every day the trust of everybody who has elected me and those who did not elect me. because I work for absolutely all of them. So popularity can be lost easily. We will see who has lost popularity and who has gained popularity, Mr. Speaker, and we will see who forms the next government. We shouldn't even have bets on that. I would like us to form the next government. I want to persuade everyone that we are the best option for Gibraltar. If anybody bothers to read the morality play, if they bother to watch what I have done in the past few hours, they will know that we have told them the truth from 1995 through to now, and that analysis bears out that we should be trusted again in the future. If economics is what's going to make an individual's mind up, they might make up their minds on something else. But I approach this from a position of full and utter humility. An election, for me, is a job interview. We each have to persuade, and who will be the best is a matter that is still to be determined. We do not want Gibraltar to fail, he said, Mr. Speaker. Well, sometimes the things that they do are designed to make Gibraltar fail. So when they say the things that they say about our public finances, about our debt, etc., about the structural things that matter, what they are doing is setting us up to fail. They need to think that through. They need to think beyond just the first move, and maybe even beyond the next move. They need to think all the way through to the last move on the chessboard. A little bit like what I tried to persuade him to do in 2001, and he wouldn't do. Mr. Speaker, he then revealed the great secret that he was prepared to work with us in the government of national unity. I don't think it was secret. I think he said so before. I think he has said so before. I think he said that across the floor of the House. But, Mr. Speaker, we were prepared to consider whether or not we needed to have a government of national unity. We didn't need one. We have brought Gibraltar to where it is today, and I think we've demonstrated that we've done a very good job in doing so. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady spoke last. I congratulate her on speaking last, because I know even that was a subject of huge controversy in the past week. So I genuinely congratulate her, at least even on that. She said that there was a general mismanagement of everyday affairs. I suppose an opposition member needs to say things like that, even if they are not true. There may be issues which need to be better addressed. I think all ministers have recognized that in their statements, but there is not a mismanagement of affairs. The amount of money going to companies is £25 million a year and going up further. Yes, I said so, and I explained, Mr. Speaker, in my statement that we were the first ones to introduce this for the reasons that I set out, because we found that the GSD had created companies that incur recurrent expenditure, but they weren't funding them. So when we were elected in 2011, we added this 25 million line so that the companies do receive structurally now, year on year, at least that 25 million. And we're upping that because it's now 8 years on and we're putting it to 30. Mr. Speaker, additionally, the debate about government companies and the numbers that have been incorporated, I have to say to her, is the debate that I've been having with Mr. Clinton almost since 2011. And it is absolutely true that the government companies, some of them have not filed accounts for the reasons that I told her. But let me just give her this additional twist, which she will enjoy. They are the ones, the GSD in government are the ones who changed the law to require all governments, all companies, including government companies, to file accounts. They didn't do it because they wanted to. There's a European directive that requires it to be done, and there's no exception for government companies. They are the ones who said that they were going to make sure that accounts continue to be filed. The GSLP, in government, without that legal requirement, had filed all of the accounts of the government companies. The GSD get elected, legislate to require everybody else to do it, and then don't file another government company account since 1996. Remarkable. That's why it's taking us so long to file them, because some of the companies are the head of these groups, and you need to reconstruct 16 years of accounts in order to be able to then file the accounts. But I've been saying that to Mr. Clinton now for some time. A lot of these accounts are now already public and filed at Companies House. And, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I hoped it would have happened by this debate. It will happen before the end of the calendar year. All of the accounts of all of the companies will be filed. Mr. Speaker, the mortgage over Gibraltar Investment Holdings Limited relates to which he referred me to, refers to the borrowing of ES Limited. Although it is termed to be in an unlimited amount, the terms of the borrowing mean that the enforcement can only be against the assets of ES Limited. But ES Limited is owned by the top company in the group, so she has the confidence that the debenture, the mortgage, is over the assets of ES Limited. And there's a drawdown, which I told the House can go up to 58 million. I told the House that this was for the distribution system that we'd added to the works of the power station. It's repayable over 10 years post-construction. The facility is at a margin of 2.98% over LIBOR, so that she sees that we do also have a repayment plan, Mr. Speaker, and this is all with Lombard in the UK. If she looks a little further and she searches ES Limited, she'll see that the same thing exists over ES Limited. This is just a question of being able to have it over ES Limited and its parent, but the recourse is only to the assets of ES Limited. The Honourable Lady's party talking to us about the old town and the need to refurbish the old town and investment in old properties as a landlord. Well, Mr. Speaker, but it is also true that she has people in her executive who are landlords who own property in the old town who are not carrying out refurbishments. And I think she needs to look a little bit closer to home to get them to have the same encouragement to do that which she is encouraging us to do. Similarly, issues relating to the environment, where I know that she has people in her environment, in her executive, Mr. Speaker, who urge environmental awareness on us and all the rest of it, but then they build on gardens in green areas and require 12 times the power that every flat in Gibraltar requires. Look, let's try and get the balance of criticism versus actual action right, Mr. Speaker. I think she's wrong about the Catalan Bay tender. She's falling into the Clintonian trap of saying that she discovers things that people say. So when somebody does something openly and honestly and says, look, I'm thinking of putting together a consortium to produce affordable housing for people in this area. If I did, and if I approach the government, would you be prepared to be one of the purchasers? She is starting to see that negatively, when actually it's very transparent, it's very open, and then it leads to a tender rather than anything else, which then hasn't been awarded. So I think all of her conclusions were I think, unfair. She has been alone in this house, Mr. Speaker, for 3.5 odd years. She was only joined by the warmth of Mr. Jamas for I don't know whether it was a few months or a few days, or I forget. I really forget. The lifetime of this Parliament is such a hurly-burly that I forget for how long she was accompanied by him. But she deserves respect for seeing through much of the nonsense that the people sitting alongside her have brought to the equation. She has listened to both sides. She has made up her own mind. She's voted with them and she's voted with us, and she deserves respect for doing that for the lion's share of the lifetime of this Parliament. Of course, every time she voted with them, she was wrong, Mr. Speaker, and every time she voted with us, she was right, Mr. Speaker. She is not right to say, Mr. Speaker, she is not right to say that there can be somebody on £145 of pension a month in Gibraltar. If that person is somebody who she's come across, you need to refer them to us, because the measure that we put in place means that people get, if they're living on their own, 1/3 of the minimum wage. If they're living as a couple, at least the minimum wage. And that is in the region of £11,000 or £12,000. If it's a couple, in the region of £7,000 or £8,000. So I think that we need to work together to try and identify if there is such a person. For that reason, she's also wrong about my commitment to the private sector pensioners. There are two aspects to this. Going forward, the private pensions bill, which is before the House. Going backwards, those who have worked but didn't have a final salary pension and who did not have a contributory pension and who had a very low one, they now have an uplift of the minimum wage. So that which is £12,800 a year or so, they all now have as a minimum guarantee in the mechanism that we've announced previously. So I think that's a huge step forward for the most needy. Now, look, what government cannot do is provide a huge amount. I mean, some of these people I've heard want £26,000 a year is the number that I've heard bandied about, just given out of the government's largesse because they didn't make provision for themselves. Some of them, very unfairly, would not have been allowed to make provision by themselves by their employer. They might have been in low-paid jobs. Some others, Mr. Speaker, were on higher-paid jobs, did not take up the option of having private pension plans with their employers, and now want the government to Rolls-Royce up the amount. So, look, there are people with real merit in this class, and there are people with less merit. The government cannot give Rolls-Royce sums. The government gives sums which are representative of where the level should be in the economy. Some of the stuff that she's saying is reminiscent to the Action on Poverty group. We cannot be suggesting that the line on poverty should be drawn above where the minimum wage is, because the minimum wage might be earned by somebody who is a young person married to another with children, and they've got the minimum wage at home, and we say that's below the poverty level for a pensioner who hasn't got his children living at home, etc., and the costs are lower. So we've got issues there that we need to disentangle to get from wanting more to actually needing more. And whether government can interfere, whether government has an obligation to interfere, especially if we're a socialist government, as we very much are, it's where people need more, not where people want more. And I hope I've made that point in a way that doesn't in any way offend anybody's sensitivities, because I don't intend to, but this is also a hard issue of government finance that has to be considered. She says housing is the biggest issue. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it always has been in the place the size of Gibraltar. It always will be. Apart from 1996, when Bebito Lagino resolved the housing list issue, we hope and aspire to be able to do so again. But it is a very, very difficult issue, especially where people now try and get themselves on the list for affordable housing, not to live, but to buy in order to be able to sell for much more later. So as I was saying before, you've got couples, single couples, who both put themselves on the list. They buy 2 apartments, they then live in one, keep one empty just to sell it for profit. That's not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's something we should all deprecate, but that's why the one RKB list is so high. We haven't lost 500 jobs in the online gaming industry, Mr. Speaker. Bet365 has given notice that it's moving some of its operations. That doesn't mean that everyone will go. I know that she will join us in hoping that as many of those jobs stay in Gibraltar as possible, but we haven't lost the job. She says we're not doing enough for tourism, but yet we're the only government to have opened 2 new attractions, and the first new hotel in 20 years, the Sunborn, then the second new hotel in 20 years, the Holiday Inn, and with 2 more in construction, the Indigo and the Leicester Hotel. Mr. Speaker, she then went through, I think, very generously in the way that she did it, because of the very kind way that she spoke about Samantha Sacramento and Neil Costa, some of the issues that she was experiencing in health and in housing in detail. And what I will do, because she was quite detailed and quite constructive in the way that she approached it, if she doesn't mind, I will send her the answers I've been given to read to her. I think there's no point my standing here and reading it to her. She wants those answers. She asked those questions, so I will let her have them so that she can pursue those issues further with the relevant ministers, as she has been doing to date. Mr. Speaker, she said some things which we cannot leave unanswered. We heard her talk about her vision for people with dementia, which is identical to the vision that we have and the work that we're doing with GADS and supporting GADS. We are the ones who have opened these facilities, so I think it's fair for us to call her out on that and say, look, that which you're saying is your commitment is that which we say is our action delivered and already improving. She made an allegation of a senior official being enriched. I think she needs to think again whether she wants to stand by that allegation. I don't think it's fair to have made that allegation. And her reference to a person begging to be allowed into Bruce's farm is one on which she and I are going to disagree. I think it is abusive to use somebody, as not she, but somebody else was trying to use them by creating that video and then threatening me personally by private message with sending it out to go viral unless I acted in a particular way. So I think it's unfair to use vulnerable people in that way, and she needs to, I'm not saying she did that, I'm saying somebody else did that, but she needs to be careful not to fall into the trap of that happening. Mr. Speaker, we are not being opportunistic on St. Martin's. We have worked with the people at St. Martin's to do the best possible plans. There have been many iterations of those plans. The best iteration required certain things to happen before we could start the works, and we're going to produce the best possible St. Martin's that this community can afford. But she's chasing us on when Governor's Meadow, when Rook. Look, Mr. Speaker, I will only tell her this once. She stood on a manifesto that didn't have any of this. She stood on a manifesto that there wasn't going to be a St. Martin's. She's then developed her thinking very well, if I may say so. But she stood on a manifesto where these things were not a priority. And we have not abandoned the Governor's Meadow at Rook. That was never our plan. That was the plan that they had in their, I said manifesto, I shouldn't have said that, in their pamphlet, Mr. Speaker. So we haven't changed that. She says, look, the idea of 2 schools next to each other is not a good thing. You shouldn't have done that. Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, it was their plan. It was their plan. The manifesto pamphlet on which she stood contained the mega school. So on that, I'm afraid I have to call her out. And the Department of Education is a policy-driven department. It is not driven by absolutely anything else, Mr. Speaker. So as I told her, Mr. Speaker, I will provide her with those answers in slower order so that she can pursue them in relation to the other ministers that she had questioned. I do not agree, I really do not agree, that we are damaging Gibraltar beyond measure. I think we are improving Gibraltar beyond measure. Mr. Speaker, the one thing that she did, which others did not do, was to pick up my invitation to reflect on where we are 50 years on. And Mr. Speaker, I thought it was helpful that somebody realized that the great importance of this debate in its historical context is to look at where we were 50 years ago. She's intimately related to somebody who was here 50 years ago, also arguing with each other, also trying to make the best, also pursuing the adversarial way of doing politics 50 years ago, as Mr. Feetham was reminding us we have to do today, perhaps in a slightly different style. Perhaps we all try and remember the past as if it were better than the present, but that's what they were doing. That year, they had a deficit of £352,000. This year, we're going to end the debate with a surplus, not a mirage, a surplus of £85 billion. It is worth doing the exercise that the Honourable Lady accompanied me on of going back 50 years to see the progress of this community. Mr. Speaker, in winding up for the government, I would really want to go back to something that a now absent member of the GSD from this House said some years ago. He said the GSD has left a golden legacy. All that glitters is not gold, Mr. Speaker, because if we apply the Clintonian argument to that golden legacy in the same way as it's been applied to us, there was no legacy to speak of. There was a £100 million accumulated deficit. It's not that it's not glittering, Mr. Speaker, it's that it's not gold. Not even red, gold, and green, like in Karma Chameleon, Mr. Speaker. What these estimates pretend to be is not gold. These estimates pretend to be a proper reflection of the grit and graft of the past year of everyone in our economy. Of everyone in our economy. We're not saying it's us. They used to say, look at what we've done. We're saying, look at what we have all produced. The person who is working in retail, the person who is working in an office, the person who is working in the public sector, look at all of us. Look at what we've done together. In particular, I say in the context of the last 50 years. Not gold, but grit and graft. The reality of a community grafting hard to make ends meet. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we're not pretending, as they used to accuse us of having gone from debt to the land of milk and honey when we took over. Remember that criticism, that old chestnut, Mr. Speaker? That's not what we're talking about here. That's not what we're talking about here. This is the work of everyone in our economy. This is working for our money, not milk and honey. And for us, as Ministers of the Crown, Mr. Speaker, it represents a great honour to be able to present these estimates to the House after the last 4 years of work, the last 8 years of work, the last 8 years of achievement. And to have done that, Mr. Speaker, to hear a collection of vacuous arguments, identical to other years, I suppose is to be expected. To hear a twisted perversion of the reality of the economic well-being of our nation, inspired by a Victorian novel referred to us 4 years ago about Micawber and how he always needed to ensure that he collected more than he spent, as if we hadn't worked that out. To hear that morass of contradictions which I have pointed out, threaded together by the irresponsibility and political ambition unleashed by some on the opposite benches, is really soul-destroying for us, because we would rather have a different debate. We would rather have a debate where we argue about the issues so that we are improved, all of us together, by that debate. But what they're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, in trying to destroy confidence in public life and confidence in politics, is not going to be good even for them if they were to achieve it. Look, they say that we're not transparent. I've done, in the time since I've been Chief Minister, 30 direct democracies. 30 direct democracies. Now, here I've got the protection of the rules of the House. On television, I've got no protection whatsoever, and I put myself out there. Even last week, Mr. Speaker, I put myself out there at any moment, and I say, ask me any question you like, and I will try and give you an answer. If it's not an area of my responsibility, I'll try and find out. But it's also my area to have responsibility for most that is going on and to know what ministers are doing. We're a collegiate government. We sit together every Monday. We know what we are each doing. I'm able to give the answers. 30 of those programs. That, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates our commitment to transparency. Mr. Speaker, I have never hidden away. And there's no need for me to hide away, because despite some of the ridiculous innuendos that we've heard from honourable members opposite, we always conduct ourselves in keeping with the higher standards of public life. Every single one of us on this side of the house. Not just because the public expected it of us, because we expect it of each other. Because each of us expects it from ourselves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have heard it said in the course of the debates the last 4 years that we campaigned in poetry and we govern in prose. I really don't think that's right. When people go back to look at the debates between 1991, 1995 in particular, and now, I think they will find that at least in these debates, we have been poetic in the way that we've represented the economic performance of our people, and poetic in the way that we have always defended the truth, as an analysis of the last 30 years of this debate will show, going back to the days that Joe Bossano was being accused of creating optical illusions. But that happens, Mr. Speaker, if you have 10 ministers working hard, none of them sitting at timeout, skiving as they had one particular minister in the time that they were in government, then you get the results, Mr. Speaker. But today, Mr. Speaker, we are united. They are totally divided. Totally divided. And when people come to choose who should lead our nation in the future, do they say, shall we choose a united army or shall we choose a divided army? I'm told that Roy hates Keith, that Keith hates Danny, that Danny hates Lawrence, that Lawrence hates Danny, that Danny also hates Damon, that Damon doesn't know who he hates, but that Edwin isn't liked inside but quite likes everybody, and that Lawrence has now come to the conclusion that he hates them all. And he's going, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, hate is a strong word, and it shouldn't be relevant to any of us, but they are desperately divided. And divided as they are, and with the economic performance that we have before the nation, it's clear that they can only beat us with lies. They can only beat us with lies, but it's more complex even than that, because they're also recanting all of the articles of faith that they had sworn between 1995 and 5 years ago. Because they are doing a side with Kahana economics, they're coming to Bossano economics, and the GSLP economic rules from 1995 are now the Bible. And yet, even so, the only way to beat us is to lie. And they're going to go out and tell the same lies they told in 1995. And in 1996, they beat us with those lies. They beat Mr. Feetham, the other Mr. Feetham. And he decided to follow that old maxim, Mr. Speaker. He decided to follow that old maxim. If you can't beat them, join them. We decided to stand and fight. We decided that we could beat them with the truth, and we would. And in the early hours of Friday the 9th of December 2011, beat them we did, Mr. Speaker, with the truth. This has been a really horrible 4 years, Mr. Speaker. We've had the horrendous issue of Brexit. We lost Juan Carlos, we lost Angeles, we lost good people, but we haven't lost our convictions. We haven't lost our convictions. They beat us with lies once, but we will never let them beat us with lies again. We will never allow that to happen. They can beat us with ideas, but we will never let them beat us with lies again. We will point out every single deception. We will point out every lie they tell about debt. We will point out every lie that they told about illusions and that they are telling now about mirages, which are just recycled and unoriginal. They have, Mr. Speaker, once again demonstrated that they have all of the malaleche and none of the brains of the GSD of 1995. This community was duped once, and we will not allow it to be duped again. Then it was Freddie, Keith, and Danny. Now it's Freddie, Keith, and Peter. Now it's Roy, Keith, and Danny. Mr. Speaker, and in the end, with the analysis I've done, I've demonstrated that they are just men without convictions who cannot sell their contradictions. And I hope that people, when they do the analysis, will allow them to come and go, but they will never put their trust in them. Not us, Mr. Speaker. We are constant. We are constant in our political and financial principles. We're constant in the defense of our people. We're constant in the defense of every single aspect of our sovereignty and our identity as a people. That's why we govern in lyrical poetry, Mr. Speaker. They're the talkers, and we're the doers. We do things. We leave a legacy of schools and parks and health centres. We leave these for people to enjoy, to benefit with, and to grow Gibraltarian families in them. And we leave them to talk about how it's been done. We leave them to say it's done properly when they're here and done improperly when we're here. All they are, at the end of the day, and all they've demonstrated in the past 72 hours, is that they are just our critics, but they're not our rivals, because they have no plan to rival us, Mr. Speaker. They haven't got a philosophy, they haven't got an ideology, they haven't got a clue. They quote Joe Bossano and Joe Bossano at Joe Bossano, and we have to quote Peter Caruana back at them, Mr. Speaker. And then they say that we're wrong about the savings bank, we're wrong about the future job strategy, we're wrong about agency workers, we're wrong about commutations, we're wrong about credit finance, and we're wrong about community care. And then they say that Joe Bossano's right about everything when he's done all of those things, Mr. Speaker. People see through this. There are too many episodes of this saga now, and people see through this, Mr. Speaker. I don't think they can persuade anyone that Joe Bossano wants a GSD government, Mr. Speaker. But if they have such a high regard for Joe Bossano, they should emulate what he does when the vote is called, and they should emulate his remarks when it comes to vote. They can't reconcile what they say on Monday from what they say on Tuesday from what the other one will say on Wednesday. Some of them said things in the morning which were different to some of the things that others said in the afternoon. That is the reality, and that is why they are our critics, but they are not our rivals, Mr. Speaker. It has been a precious honour, Mr. Speaker, to deliver 8 successive budget addresses to this House as Chief Minister and Leader of the House. All of them with surpluses, Mr. Speaker, unless none of them for the past 30 years have been with surpluses. It has been a precious honour, Mr. Speaker, to be a legislator for this community for the past 16 years, representing our people in various roles in this place. And I face the electorate, Mr. Speaker, with the humility of having done as best as I could, as I was humanly possible in the last 8 years. Mr. Speaker, in winding up the debate, this nation deserves to congratulate itself, not to talk itself down as they are suggesting. Of course we have to be careful. Of course we must heed Sir Joe's warning. Sir Joe is here giving the warning on our behalf, and to them too, Mr. Speaker. We are giving this warning as a government. That's why this is a budget designed to be sustainable. A careful budget designed with the long term in mind, taking seriously our responsibility to deliver a long-term sustainable Gibraltar. For all of us to have the economic strength. That's why this is not a budget with election goodies. This is no budget of giveaways, but a budget of opportunities, making sure every capital project is properly funded, making sure the rainy day funds are properly maintained, making sure we protect the Gibraltar that made us strong so it can make our children strong too. Because we must think of the next generation, not of the next general election in a debate like this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every morality play ends the same way. In the end, the truth will out. That's why we will win the next general election. Because the people of Gibraltar are no fools. Because we will fight it with the truth as our sharpest weapon. Because we've told our people the truth at every turn, even in these politically challenging times. That is why we've earned the respect and support of our community. With hard work, with dedication, and principally with humility. We have battered it out of the park in economic performance, Mr. Speaker. We have battered it out of the park in creating employment. We've battered it out of the park in new services for our people. We've earned 4 more years, Mr. Speaker, with dedication, with commitment, with hard work. And because, Mr. Speaker, the best is yet to come, I commend the bill to the House. Perhaps to give people an opportunity to have a bite to eat and to give me an opportunity to have some water, can I suggest that the House return at 2:30?
But before you do that, I have to put the question. I now put the question, which is that a bill for an act to appropriate sums of money to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2020 be read a second time. Those in favour?
Mr. Speaker.
You want a division? Very well. P.J. Valvan.
Aye.
J.J. Bossano.
Yes.
R.M. Clinton.
No.
J.E. Cortez.
Aye.
NF, sorry, he's not there.
D.A. Feetham. No. J.J. Garcia.
Yes.
T.N. Hammond.
No.
M.D. Hassan Naon.
Yes.
A.J. Isula.
Aye.
G.H. Likudi.
Yes.
S.E. Linares.
Yes.
S.E. Likudi. Beg pardon, S.E. Linares. I called. Yeah. Been a long morning. L.F. Yamas.
No.
E.J. Phillips.
No.
F.R. Picardo.
Aye.
E.J. Reyes.
No.
S.J. Sacramento.
Yes.
There is one member absent. There are 10 yes, 10 vote in favour, 6 against. The second reading of the bill is carried.